A man with nothing left to lose walked into the most powerful boardroom in the city and changed everything. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't an executive, he was the janitor, and what he knew was about to bring an empire to its knees. If you've ever been counted out, written off, or told you don't belong at the table, this story is for you. Watch until the end, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The elevator doors opened at 11:47 p.m., and Ethan Parker stepped out onto the 42nd floor with a mop, a rolling bucket, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't sleep away anymore. He was 32 years old. He'd stopped thinking of himself as young about 18 months ago. The executive floor of Vantage Capital Group smelled like a different world, leather and synthetic lemon polish, and the ghost of expensive cologne. The kind of smell that said people made serious decisions in these rooms, decisions that rippled outward into neighborhoods and bank accounts and families that would never know this floor existed. Ethan had been cleaning it 5 nights a week for 11 months. He knew every office, every conference room, every trash can that executives never thought twice about leaving full. He started at the far end of the corridor, the way he always did, conference room. A first, then the corner offices, then the long stretch of glass-walled meeting rooms that looked out over the city like a row of fish tanks. At this hour, the floor was empty except for him, which was how he preferred it. Empty meant nobody looked at him. Nobody looked at him meant he didn't have to decide what face to make. He was good at his job. That part had surprised him, back at the beginning, how quickly he'd learned to move through a space without disturbing it, how to leave things exactly as they'd been, except cleaner, quieter, as if the floor had simply reset overnight. There was a specific skill to erasure, and he'd developed it without meaning to. He pushed the mop through the corridor, mind drifting the way it always did after midnight, landing on Sophie. Sophie Parker, age 7, currently asleep in a hospital bed on the 9th floor of Mercy General, 12 blocks away. Her breathing was better this week. That was what Dr. Reyes had said on Tuesday. Her breathing is better, Mr. Parker. We're encouraged. And Ethan had held on to that word like a coin he kept checking was still in his pocket. Encouraged. Not fixed. Not clear. Encouraged. The treatment was working, but it was expensive. The insurance covered 60% of an amount that still left Ethan Parker, formerly of Whitmore and Salk Analytics, currently of Meridian Building Services, staring at numbers that didn't resolve. He stopped at conference room B. The light was on. That was the first wrong thing. He always turned the lights off when he cleaned. He'd been the last person on this floor at midnight for 11 months, and the lights were never on when he arrived. He stood in the doorway for a second, hand on the frame, doing a quick scan of the room. Nobody inside. Somebody had left in a hurry. He went in. The long conference table was uncharacteristically messy. That was the second wrong thing. The executive floor operated on a specific kind of controlled tidiness that Ethan had come to recognize as performance. Everything staged, everything in its place. The whole floor designed to look like serious people took serious things seriously. But tonight the table was scattered, printed pages face up and face down. 2 coffee cups left without their saucers. A whiteboard on the rolling stand covered in numbers that someone had started to erase and then apparently decided not to. He started collecting the coffee cups. That was when he saw the document. It wasn't the whole thing, just the top page of a stack that had slid partially off the table and fanned out across the corner. A cover page. He almost didn't read it. Meridian Holloway. Acquisition, Consolidated Workforce, Impact Assessment, Final Draft, Confidential. Ethan put the coffee cup down. He looked at the door. Empty corridor. He looked at the document. He didn't touch it. He crouched down slightly so he could read it from the angle it was already lying, a habit so ingrained it was almost unconscious. The way you look at something you're not supposed to see while making sure you could always say you didn't pick it up. The cover page listed summary figures. He scanned them in seconds, the way he'd once scanned quarterly reports before the coffee in the cup on his desk had gone cold. 2,300 positions. Projected workforce reduction following acquisition close. He read it again. 2,300 positions. He looked at the whiteboard. The numbers there didn't make sense at first, and then they did. The way a magic eye image resolves if you stop trying. He could read financial projections the way other people read words. It had been his only real talent, once. The figures on that whiteboard, even half erased, told a story that the polished language of the cover page was designed to obscure. The projected savings from workforce reduction were being booked as operational efficiency gains in a column that was nowhere near the liability disclosure section. He stood up straight. This wasn't just a merger. The top-line numbers he was seeing didn't account for a major something, a something he could calculate roughly in his head and come out somewhere that would spook any serious institutional investor. The deal was structured in a way that buried future exposure under short-term asset valuations. He'd seen this before. Not the same shape, but the same trick. He left the conference room and finished his shift. He mopped every floor, emptied every trash can, wiped every counter in the executive kitchen. He was thorough. He was always thorough. He clocked out at 2:18 a.m., took the bus to the hospital, sat in the chair beside Sophie's bed for 40 minutes watching her sleep, and then took the bus home, where he sat at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything he'd seen. Not because he planned to do anything with it. He told himself that. He just needed to get it out of his head. Go. He'd been on Wall Street for 4 years before everything went sideways. Whitmore and Salk had hired him straight out of graduate school. Quantitative analytics. He'd been good at the work in a way that felt effortless. The numbers behaving themselves the way they never quite did for the people who'd gone to better schools and grown up with more comfortable versions of difficulty. He'd made analyst in under 3 years. He'd had a desk by the window. He'd had a life that felt, from the outside, like the beginning of something. Then he'd found the irregularities in the Paragon Energy projections. He hadn't meant to find them. He'd been pulling comps for an unrelated client when a number didn't match, and he'd gone looking for the discrepancy the way you'd follow a loose thread, not expecting it to unravel anything, just needing it to resolve. What he found instead was a systematic pattern of inflated reserve valuations that Whitmore and Salk's senior partners had been aware of for at least 18 months. He'd reported it internally first. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was not understanding that when you find a problem that large and you work for the people who created it, you become the problem. He was terminated 6 weeks later. Misconduct, they said, unauthorized disclosure of proprietary models. He'd contested it. He'd hired a lawyer he couldn't really afford with money he didn't really have, and the process had ground through 16 months and ended with a settlement that covered his legal fees and not much else, and a non-disclosure agreement that had enough teeth to limit what he could say and to whom. Sophie's mother left when Sophie was 3 years old, not because she was cruel. Ethan had spent a long time not wanting to think of her as cruel, but because she'd married a man who was going somewhere and found herself instead watching someone fall, and she didn't want to fall with him. He understood it better now than he had then. He'd spent 6 months after the settlement doing nothing useful. He wasn't proud of that period. He drank more than he should have. He let things go. He was aware, in a distant sort of way, that he was in trouble, but the trouble had a texture he didn't know how to grip. Then Sophie got sick, and he stopped having the luxury of being lost. The janitor job was temporary. That was what he'd told himself when he took it. It was a way to keep Sophie's insurance active while he figured out next steps. That had been 11 months ago, and he hadn't figured out next steps, but Sophie's insurance was active, and the bills were mostly current, and the refrigerator had food in it, and those things, he'd discovered, were enough to keep you from looking too far ahead. He looked at the yellow legal pad. 2,300 jobs. He put it in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus and tried to sleep. He couldn't sleep. By 4:30 in the morning, he was back at the kitchen table with the legal pad, and by 6 he had a rough model sketched out from memory, revenue projections, the liability exposure that wasn't being disclosed, the gap between what the Holloway board was being told and what the actual 5-year picture looked like when you ran the numbers without the accounting adjustments. It wasn't complete. He was working from fragments. A cover page he'd read at an angle, a whiteboard partially erased, numbers recalled from a single scan. But incomplete as it was enough to establish the shape of the problem. The deal closed in 36 hours. The signing ceremony was already on the financial news. He'd seen the Chiron the previous afternoon on the hospital room television, Charlotte Hayes of Vantage Capital Group, and James Holloway of Holloway Industries, the kind of joint press conference where everyone wore expensive suits and said nothing specific. Charlotte Hayes. He knew who she was, the way he knew who most major figures in corporate finance were. Peripherally, accurately. She'd run Vantage for 3 years, taken it from a mid-tier investment group to one of the city's most watched firms. 30 years old when she'd been appointed, which had generated considerable commentary from people who had opinions about such things. From what he'd read in those years, she was sharp, direct, and not particularly interested in being liked. Her results spoke for her, and she apparently let them. If she signed this deal, she wouldn't be the villain in the story. She'd be the person who didn't have the information. That distinction mattered to him. He wasn't sure why it mattered, but it did. He sat for a long time looking at the legal pad. Then, he went to get ready for the hospital visit, and while he was brushing his teeth, he thought, if I do nothing, 2,300 people lose their jobs. Some of them are parents. Some of them have kids in hospitals. Most of them don't know the deal is happening. He spat, rinsed, looked at himself in the mirror. He looked terrible. He usually did. You've already lost everything once, he thought. What exactly are you protecting? The signing ceremony was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the Vantage Capital main conference room on the 38th floor, 4 floors below the executive suite where Ethan worked nights. He knew the building's layout completely. He also knew that the cleaning staff had access badge privileges that hadn't been updated since the building's last security review, which meant his badge would still open the service entrance on the 38th floor. He wasn't proud of this plan. He was aware that it was probably not a good plan. He was aware that walking into a major corporate signing ceremony in civilian clothes with a handwritten legal pad and a partial financial analysis reconstructed from memory was not, by any conventional measure, a promising approach. He was also aware that he had no other approach. He got to the hospital at 8, sat with Sophie while she ate breakfast and complained about the orange juice being too cold, and let her show him a drawing she'd done of a horse that looked more like a dog, but that she insisted was a horse, and he agreed with her completely. Dr. Reyes came by during rounds and said the same thing she'd said Tuesday, which was that the treatment was progressing and they were encouraged. You look tired, Sophie said. I'm always tired. More tired than usual. I have something I need to do today. She looked at him with the specific precision that 7-year-olds have when they're paying closer attention than you want them to. Is it something that could get you in trouble? Hopefully not. Hopefully is not no. You're right, he said. It's not no. She thought about this. Is it important? He looked at her. She had her mother's eyes and his stubborn jaw, and the combination produced an expression that he'd never been able to talk himself around. Yeah, he said. I think it is. Okay. She picked up the drawing of the horse that was a dog. Don't be late for dinner. I'll try. That's also not a yes. I'm aware. She handed him the drawing. For luck. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He kissed her forehead and left before he could think about it too much. Quit. The service entrance on the 38th floor smelled like the rest of the building. Recirculated air and commercial carpet cleaner. And Ethan stood in the utility corridor for a minute after the door closed behind him, getting his bearings. He was wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, dark slacks, a gray button-down, dress shoes he'd kept from his old life mostly out of stubbornness. He didn't look like someone who belonged on this floor, but he didn't look like a janitor either. He looked like someone who dressed carefully for something they were nervous about, which was accurate. The signing was in the main conference room. He could hear activity through the walls, footsteps, the specific timbre of a catered event, the murmur of background conversation that meant a lot of people standing around with coffee waiting for something to start. He checked his watch, 8:57. He'd been walking toward things he wasn't supposed to be part of for his entire adult life. He walked toward this one. The corridor opened into the main reception area of the 38th floor, and Ethan stepped out of it as though he'd always planned to be there and turned left toward the conference room. A young woman at a temporary check-in station near the conference room doors looked up at him, then at her tablet. Name? Ethan Parker, he said. I need to speak with Ms. Hayes before the signing. Are you on the guest list? No. She blinked. Sir, I understand I'm not on the list. I need 2 minutes with Charlotte Hayes before she signs. It's important. I'm going to need to ask you to tell her it's about the workforce impact assessment, the final draft. He held the woman's gaze. 2 minutes. The young woman looked at him with the particular expression people wear when they're trying to decide if someone is dangerous or just unusual. He was apparently reading as unusual because she didn't call security. She said, "Wait here," and walked away with her tablet. He waited. The reception area had a view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Ethan stood with his hands in his pockets looking at it without seeing it. He was aware of his heartbeat. He was aware of the folded drawing in his shirt pocket. He was aware that in approximately 90 seconds, he was either going to be escorted out of the building by security, or he was going to be standing in front of one of the most powerful executives in the city with a handwritten legal pad and a story that was going to sound, on its surface, like the story of a man who'd lost his perspective along with his career. He heard footsteps. He turned. Charlotte Hayes walked out of the conference room the way people walk when they're accustomed to rooms adjusting themselves around their presence. She was taller than she appeared in photographs. The photographs always seemed to get her wrong somehow. And she wore the particular expression of someone who'd been interrupted at a bad moment and was deciding in real time how much latitude to give the interruption. She was flanked by a man in a dark suit who Ethan recognized from the financial press as Marcus Webb, Vantage's chief operating officer, who was currently looking at Ethan the way you look at something that has wandered in from outside and needs to be returned there. "Ms. Hayes," Ethan said, "my name is Ethan Parker. I work nights on your 42nd floor. I need 3 minutes." Charlotte Hayes looked at him with dark eyes that were doing several calculations at once. She said nothing for a moment. Webb said, "Charlotte, we have 12 minutes before—" "What's the workforce impact assessment?" she said. Ethan held her gaze. "A document left in conference room B last night that projects 2,300 positions eliminated post-acquisition. That number is not in the materials you've been presented to my knowledge, and there are figures in the deal structure that suggest the liability exposure to Vantage following close is significantly higher than what's been disclosed." He paused. "I worked in quantitative analytics for 4 years. I know what I'm looking at." The air in the reception area had changed. Webb had gone very still. Charlotte Hayes hadn't moved. "You're the janitor," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "You read confidential documents." "I read a document that was lying open on the conference table when I came in to clean at midnight. I didn't touch it." He held the legal pad. "I ran what I could recall from memory. I know it's incomplete, but what I have is enough to tell you something is wrong with this deal." Charlotte Hayes looked at the legal pad. Then she looked at Marcus Webb. Webb's jaw was set in a way that Ethan recognized immediately. Not anger, something more careful than anger. The specific quality of a person who has been startled into stillness by something they weren't expecting. Charlotte seemed to notice this too, because something shifted almost imperceptibly in her face. "Marcus," she said, "tell James I'll be 5 minutes." "Charlotte, 5 minutes!" She looked back at Ethan. "Follow me." She took him to a small office off the reception area, an advisor's workspace, temporarily vacant, and closed the door. She stood on the other side of the desk rather than sitting, which he noticed. She didn't sit because sitting would have implied a longer conversation than she was currently committed to having. She was still deciding. "Show me," she said. He opened the legal pad to the first page and laid it flat on the desk between them. "I'm working from memory, so the exact figures are approximate, but the structure is here. The projected synergy savings from workforce reduction, which is how the deal documents are characterizing the 2,300 positions, are being credited against operational costs in year 2 and 3 projections. They're not being run through the severance and benefits liability line." Charlotte looked at the legal pad. Her face was composed, not blank, but controlled. She was reading. "That means the net efficiency gains in the projections are overstated by whatever the true severance exposure works out to across 2,300 employees," Ethan continued. "Based on Holloway Industries' average compensation profile from their public filings, that's somewhere between 140 million, she said quietly. He stopped. She looked up. "Give or take, that's where that number would land." "You've run this." "I've been running a lot of numbers for a long time." She straightened slightly, looking at him with a more complex expression than before. "The question is how you got from this." She gestured at the legal pad. "To understanding that structure from a partially erased whiteboard at midnight. I told you, I worked in analytics." You cleaned the 42nd floor for 11 months. I work nights now. She looked at him for a moment that stretched just past comfortable. Why? He hadn't expected that question. My daughter is sick. I needed the insurance coverage. Something moved behind her eyes, brief and not quite identifiable, and then she was back to the legal pad. The workforce assessment document. Is there more in it than what you saw? I only saw the cover page, but the cover page referenced appendices, which means the full impact analysis exists somewhere and isn't in the materials you've been presented. That's the part you should be asking about. Marcus Webb is my COO, she said carefully. He's managed the integration planning. I know. She looked at him directly. You understand what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you a document exists that characterizes the impact of this deal in a way that's materially different from what I'd expect to find in the materials presented to your board. What that means and why it's the case, you'd know better than I would. Charlotte Hayes was quiet for a moment. Outside the office, they could hear the low ambient sound of a major corporate event, catering staff, a news crew setting up, the specific restless energy of people waiting for something official to happen. The signing is in 7 minutes, she said. I know. She looked at the legal pad again. He could see her working through it, not the numbers, which she clearly already had, but the implications. What it meant. Who had to know? What she didn't know yet that she needed to know before she put her signature on something. What happened to you on Wall Street? She asked. It wasn't small talk. The question had the quality of a piece of information she determined she needed. I found something I wasn't supposed to find and reported it to people who'd helped create it. Terminated for unauthorized disclosure. Settled. Signed an NDA. Paragon Energy? He was quiet for a second. I can't confirm that. The corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. The NDA. Yes. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're already 3 steps ahead. Did you come here to protect 2,300 jobs or to settle a score? The question hit harder than he expected. Not because it was unfair. It wasn't unfair. It was a reasonable thing to need to know. But because he'd asked himself the same question sitting at his kitchen table at 4 a.m. and hadn't fully resolved it. I came here, he said, because I have a 7-year-old daughter who's sick, and I've spent the last year moving through rooms in this city that I'm supposed to not see anything in. And last night I saw something. I don't have anything left to protect from this. But those 2,300 people do. Charlotte Hayes looked at him for a long moment. Your name again. Ethan Parker. She picked up the legal pad. I need this for the next hour. It's yours. If you're wrong, I know. If you fabricated this, I know what happens then, too. She held the legal pad in both hands and looked at him with an expression that was still primarily calculating but had something else in it now. Something he didn't try to name. Go to the 41st floor. There's a waiting area outside the main boardroom. Don't talk to anyone. If I need you, I'll send someone. He nodded. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle. Without turning. Your daughter, is she going to be okay? He didn't answer immediately. The doctors say they're encouraged. She opened the door and walked out. He sat in the waiting area on the 41st floor for 45 minutes. In that time, 3 things happened. A man in a dark suit walked past him twice without looking at him directly, which was how people looked when they were very deliberately not looking. The ambient sound from the floors above changed twice in ways he couldn't quite identify, and his phone buzzed once with a text from the hospital number. Sophie's vitals, good this morning, routine check, no action needed. And he stared at that text for a full minute before putting the phone back in his pocket. He thought about the drawing of the horse that was a dog. He thought about whether he had just made a catastrophic mistake. He thought about the whiteboard numbers and the cover page and the $140 million gap between what Vantage Capital was being told this deal was worth and what it would actually cost. He thought about what it meant that Marcus Webb had gone very still when he'd said workforce impact assessment. Still wasn't surprised. Still was the reaction of someone who already knew the document existed. He thought about Charlotte Hayes' face when she'd asked why he'd come. I don't have anything left to protect from this. He'd meant it. He'd also known, saying it, that it wasn't entirely true. Because Sophie was something left. Sophie was the whole point of all of it. And whatever happened in the next hour would determine whether Ethan Parker went home to his daughter tonight with the last of his credibility intact, or was escorted out of this building by security and met at home by something worse. He checked his watch. 10:48. The signing had been scheduled for 10. He was still in the building. The woman who appeared at the entrance to the waiting area at 10:52 was not the young woman from the check-in station. She was somewhere in her 40s, sharp-eyed, carrying a tablet with the specific directness of someone who moved at one speed. "Mr. Parker?" He stood. "Yes." "Ms. Hayes would like you in conference room B on 42. She held the door. "Follow me." He followed. Conference room B looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow, and more ordinary. Charlotte Hayes was standing at the window when he came in, not at the table. She was still holding his legal pad. She turned when he entered, and whatever calculation had been running behind her eyes during their first conversation had resolved into something harder and more specific. "I pulled the full integration planning file," she said. "The workforce assessment was in the restricted folder. Marcus Webb and 2 others have edit access. It was last modified 4 days ago." Ethan stood by the door. 4 days ago. "The board materials were finalized 6 days ago." She set the legal pad on the table. "The document was modified after the board presentation was approved." The weight of that settled into the room. "The modification was a reduction," she said. "The original version projected 1,900 positions. Someone changed it to 2,300. She looked at him steadily. "You saw the 2,300 figure?" "Yes." "Which means whoever left this in conference room B last night either was careless or intended for someone to see it." Ethan had not considered that possibility. He considered it now. "Someone wanted the deal stopped. Or someone wanted me to have information that would compromise me if I used it." Her voice was even. "Documents obtained by a night janitor who had no authorization to see them. There's a version of this where I'm the problem. I understand that. Do you?" It wasn't a question. "Because right now there are 3 senior executives downstairs in a boardroom with James Holloway's legal team and a room full of press, and the story of what happens next is going to be written by someone. The question is who?" He looked at her. "What did you tell them?" "That I needed additional time to review integration documentation. That I want a full accounting of the workforce impact projections before I sign." She folded her arms. "Marcus told me it wasn't necessary. He told me the integration plan was thorough and I'd been over all the material." "He said that?" "He also said," she paused slightly, "that bringing an outside concern to the table at this stage from an unofficial source could expose Vantage to significant liability." She looked at Ethan directly. "He meant you. I figured. He wants to know who you are and how you accessed confidential materials." Another pause. "He's going to find out who you are in approximately the next 20 minutes, regardless." Ethan nodded. He'd known this was part of it. He'd known it since 4 a.m, and he'd come anyway. "What do you need from me?" Charlotte Hayes looked at him for a moment. The same quality of look she'd given him in the small office downstairs, the one doing several things at once. And then she said something that surprised him. "I need to know if you're right. Not I need you to prove it. Not I need documentation. I need to know if you're right," which was the question underneath all the others, the one that everything else depended on. "I'm right," he said. "The gap is real. The liability exposure in the deal structure is understated by at least $100 million, and whatever is in the full version of that workforce document, somebody modified it in the last 4 days without including those changes in the board materials." He held her gaze. "You already know I'm right. You said you'd been running these numbers." She was quiet. "You had doubts before I walked in this morning," he said. "I have doubts about most things," she said evenly. "You had specific doubts about this deal." She didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer. Instead, she walked to the table and picked up her phone. "I'm going to need the rest of today," she said, not quite to him. "And I'm going to need someone who can walk me through the financial structure in detail, someone who isn't on this floor's payroll." He understood what she was saying. "I'm available." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. You understand this could get worse before it gets better. It's already worse than it was yesterday. Fair. She set the phone down. Can you be back here at 2 o'clock? Yes. And you'll want... She hesitated in a way that seemed uncharacteristic. You'll want to talk to someone about your situation, legally, before Marcus finds out who you are and starts calling it theft of proprietary information. I can't afford a lawyer. I know a lawyer, she said, who owes me a favor. He stood with his hand on the door. He looked at Charlotte Hayes standing at the conference table in the morning light, holding his handwritten legal pad with its rough calculations and half-formed numbers. And he thought about all the rooms he'd been in that he wasn't supposed to be in, all the things he'd seen that nobody had thought he was capable of seeing, all the years of being nobody in spaces built for somebody else. Thank you, he said. She shook her head slightly. Don't thank me yet. We haven't done anything yet. A pause. 2 o'clock, Mr. Parker? He walked out. He took the service corridor back to the elevator. He went down to the lobby and out into the street, where the city was loud and specific and indifferent to everything that had just happened on the 38th and 42nd floors of the building behind him. He put his hand to his shirt pocket. The drawing was still there. He took out his phone and called the hospital. Sophie Parker's room, he said when someone answered. I'm her father. Can you tell her I'll be there for dinner? He listened. Thank you, he said, and hung up. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he started walking. He had 4 hours until 2 o'clock, and he needed to find a place to sit down and reconstruct everything he remembered about the Holloway deal structure from the beginning, before the details he'd kept in his head all night started to blur. He had work to do. It was, he thought distantly, the first time in a long time he'd had something that felt like that. The lawyer's name was Diana Cho, and she met Ethan at a coffee shop on Clement Street at noon with the specific energy of someone doing a favor they hadn't fully agreed to yet. She was compact and precise, maybe 45, with reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose and a legal pad of her own that she opened to a fresh page before he'd even sat down. Charlotte Hayes had called ahead. Diana had listened to whatever Charlotte said and apparently decided it was worth an hour of her time, though her expression suggested the jury was still out. Charlotte says you walked into the Vantage signing ceremony this morning, Diana said, before he'd ordered coffee. I did. With a handwritten financial analysis you reconstructed from memory. Yes. She looked at him over the glasses. You understand how that sounds. I do. And before that you read confidential documents on an executive floor you were cleaning. I read a cover page that was lying open on a table. I didn't remove anything. She wrote something. The distinction matters, but it doesn't fully protect you. Depending on how Vantage's legal team characterizes your presence on that floor and what you did with the information, they could pursue misappropriation of trade secrets, particularly if Marcus Webb pushes it. I know. Charlotte thinks Webb is going to push it. Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Charlotte's probably right. Diana looked at him for a moment, assessing, not unkind. She also says you used to work in analytics, Whitmore and Salk. He nodded once. I know that case, she said quietly. Not the details. The shape of it. She paused. You got a bad deal. I got the deal I got. That's not the same thing. She closed the legal pad slightly. Here's what I can do. I can put together a protective memo establishing that you acted in good faith based on information you observed inadvertently in the course of your employment. It won't be bulletproof, but it creates a record. If Webb moves against you, we have a starting position. She tilted her head. It's not nothing. It's not nothing, he agreed. You'll also need to be careful this afternoon. Charlotte is going to want you walking her through financial structures. And every conversation you have inside that building creates potential exposure. She slid a card across the table. If anyone on Vantage's legal team contacts you directly, anyone, you call me first. Don't answer questions. Don't explain yourself. Call me. He took the card. Thank you. Thanks, Charlotte, Diana said. She's calling in something I owe her from 3 years ago, and she knows it. She picked up her coffee. What's actually wrong with the deal? In plain language. He told her. He laid it out the way he'd been laying it out in his head all morning. The liability gap, the workforce assessment modification, The way the projected synergy savings had been structured to overstate the deal's net value. Diana listened without interrupting, which told him she was following it. She pushed her glasses up twice. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "If what you're describing is accurate," she said, "and someone on Vantage's leadership team knew about it and proceeded anyway, that's not just a bad deal. That's fraud." "Yes. That changes the exposure profile considerably, for everyone." She looked at him steadily. "Including you." "I know. You came forward anyway." He thought of Sophie's horse that looked like a dog, folded in his shirt pocket. "I came forward anyway." Diana Cho looked at him for another moment, then wrote something on the legal pad, tore off the page and slid it across to him. "My cell. The card has my office number. Use the cell." He was back at Vantage Capital at 5 minutes to 2, this time through the main lobby entrance where Charlotte had left his name with security. The contrast with his midnight approach through the service corridor was not lost on him. Same building, completely different version of himself moving through it. Or maybe the same version, differently visible. Charlotte's assistant, a young man named Kevin, who had the demeanor of someone managing a situation he hadn't been briefed on, walked him up to the 42nd floor and into a conference room that wasn't Conference Room B. This one was on the east side of the building, smaller, with a table that seated 6 instead of 20. Charlotte was already there, along with a woman Ethan didn't recognize, mid-30s, natural hair, sharp eyes, a laptop open in front of her, and a posture that said she was already working. "This is Renata Osei," Charlotte said. "She's my senior financial analyst. She's been with me for 2 years, and she is the only person on this floor I'm certain is not part of the problem." She said this the way people say things they've had to think hard about and have decided to just say directly. Renata looked at Ethan with an evaluating expression. "You're the janitor." "I am." "Charlotte says you ran projections from memory." "Rough projections, from a partial view." "Let me see." She held out her hand. He still had the legal pad. Charlotte had returned it before he left that morning. He handed it to Renata, who studied it the way people study things they find more interesting than they expected to. She didn't say anything for 30 seconds. "The compensation profile," she said finally. "How did you get the average comp figure for Holloway?" "Public filings. Their last 3 proxy statements show average total compensation by band. I used a weighted average and assumed a roughly normal distribution across the workforce." Renata looked at Charlotte, then back at Ethan. "That's close. It's not exact, but it's close." "I didn't have exact." "No," she said. "You didn't." She set the legal pad down. "The real number is 162 million, not 140, but the rest of the structure is right." She pulled the laptop toward her. "I've been in the integration folder for the last 3 hours. The workforce assessment file has a version history. The modification 4 days ago wasn't a correction. It was an insertion. Somebody added a separate column of figures that doesn't connect to anything else in the model. It looks like a projection, but it's not tethered to any underlying data." She turned the laptop to face them. "It's decorative math." Charlotte was standing with her arms folded, not quite leaning against the wall behind her. She'd changed from the morning's clothes, same level of formal, but different, which meant she'd been here long enough for that to matter. "Decorative math," she repeated. "Numbers that look like analysis but are designed to produce a specific output regardless of input. You change the assumptions, and the answer comes out the same." Renata's voice was flat and technical. "Somebody built the conclusion first and worked backward." The room was quiet for a moment. "Who has edit access to that folder?" Ethan asked. "Marcus Webb. Thomas Greer. He's the head of transaction structuring. And a third name I didn't recognize at first, a user account that shows up as a contractor ID." Renata looked at Charlotte carefully. "The contractor ID maps to an external firm called Arca Advisory." Charlotte's expression shifted by something small and specific. "Arca. You know them?" Ethan said. "I know of them. They've worked with Holloway Industries before. Product launch consulting, public-facing work. They shouldn't have any access to our internal integration planning." She looked at Renata. "How long has that account had access?" 9 weeks. 9 weeks was before the board materials were finalized, before the deal was announced to the press. 9 weeks ago, an outside contractor affiliated with Holloway Industries had been given access to Vantage Capital's internal integration planning files, and nobody had flagged it. The shape of it was becoming clearer, and it was not a comfortable shape. Someone on the inside gave Arca the access, Ethan said. Yes, Charlotte said, which means the manipulation of the integration model wasn't an error, and it wasn't a last-minute adjustment. It was planned. Yes, he looked at her. You already knew the deal had problems. She met his gaze directly. I knew the projections were optimistic. That's not unusual in acquisition scenarios. Everyone is selling something. I pushed back on the efficiency timeline twice in the last month. Both times, Marcus came back with revised documentation that addressed the specific number I'd questioned. A beat. I should have asked harder questions about where the revised documentation came from. You trusted your COO. I trusted my COO, she said, with a flatness that was more honest than any elaboration would have been. Renata had gone back to the laptop and was pulling something else up. There's more. The liability exposure Ethan identified, but the understated severance. That's one piece. The bigger piece is in the asset valuations. She turned the screen again. Holloway Industries has a commercial real estate portfolio that's being carried in the deal at book value, but 3 of the properties were the subject of environmental assessments 18 months ago. Contamination findings, remediation costs were estimated at the time at somewhere between 40 and 90 million depending on scope. She looked at them both. None of that is in the deal materials. The silence in the room stretched. Ethan did the arithmetic without meaning to. It was reflexive, the way breathing was reflexive. The understated severance liability, the overstated asset values, the gap between what the deal said it was worth and what it would actually cost Vantage once both were accounted for. How much are we talking total? Charlotte asked, though her tone suggested she already had a number. Best case, 200 million in undisclosed exposure, Renata said. Worst case, closer to 350. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Just a second, less than a second, and then opened them and was back to the controlled expression. But Ethan had seen it. The specific weariness of someone who has been right about something they desperately wanted to be wrong about. The signing didn't happen this morning, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. He'd inferred it from the fact that he was still sitting in this building having this conversation. I told James Holloway I needed 72 hours for an internal documentation review. His legal team was not pleased. She paused. Marcus was not pleased. What did Webb say? He said the delay was damaging to Vantage's market position, and he was concerned about the source of my decision. Her voice was careful. He asked if I'd been in contact with anyone outside the company who might have an interest in the deal failing. He was asking about me. He was asking about you. She uncrossed her arms and sat down, finally, across the table from Renata. He doesn't know your name yet, but he's asking the building's security office about badge access to the signing floor this morning. He'll find me by tonight. Probably. She looked at him directly. When he does, the most likely move is to characterize everything you've told me as coming from a source with a history of grievances against corporate financial institutions, and then to characterize my response to your information as a breach of my fiduciary duty to the deal. She paused. It's not a weak argument from a certain angle. Ethan looked at her steadily. He'd thought about this too, somewhere between Diana Cho's coffee shop and this room. The information is real regardless of where it came from. I know that. That's not how the argument works. No, he said, it's not. Renata had been watching this exchange with the neutral attention of someone filing things away. She said, the environmental assessments on the Holloway properties, they're not in our internal files, but they're not entirely buried either. The assessments were conducted by a state environmental agency. They'd be a matter of public record. Where? Ethan asked. State Environmental Database. Filings under Holloway's property, LLCs. She looked at him. If you can find them there, independently, then the information isn't tainted by the internal documents. It's public. The path forward was clarifying, the way paths do when you stop looking at how complicated they are and start looking at where they actually go. Give me the property addresses and the LLC names, Ethan said. I'll pull the environmental filings tonight. Charlotte was looking at him again with that layered expression. Tonight you're working. Tonight I'm working, after my shift. He paused. I need a laptop. I don't have one at home that's worth using. Charlotte glanced at Renata, who closed her laptop and pushed it across the table without being asked. Use mine. I can pull something from the supply closet for tonight. Thank you. Don't thank me. It's a 3-year-old model. He almost smiled. I've worked with worse. Chat. The hospital visit that evening ran long because Sophie was having a good day. The best day in recent weeks, actually. Alert and talkative and full of opinions about the television programming and the quality of the hospital's macaroni and cheese, which she rated as a 3 out of 10 and offered extensive improvement notes on. He sat with her through dinner and through the early part of the evening news, which she tolerated mostly because she liked the weather forecast. Did you do the important thing? She asked during a commercial. I started it. Is it going well? He thought about Renata's laptop and the environmental databases and $300 million in undisclosed exposure. It's going, he said. That's also not a yes. You're very persistent. You say that like it's bad. It's not bad. He adjusted the blanket around her legs. It's you. She was quiet for a moment, watching the television with the specific casualness of someone who was actually thinking about something else. The nurses were talking today, she said. They thought I was asleep. They were talking about a girl in the room down the hall. She had to stop treatment because her dad's insurance ran out. He was very still. I know our insurance is okay, Sophie said. You told me. I'm just saying. She looked at him sideways. I think that's why you're doing the important thing. He didn't say anything for a moment. Yeah, partly. What's the other part? He thought about the whiteboard, about 2,300 names that weren't names, that were numbers in a column, lives reduced to projected savings. There are a lot of people who are going to find out something bad is happening to them, and they won't know until it's too late to do anything about it. He paused. I can do something about it, right now. I might be the only person who can. Sophie considered this with the gravity that she brought to things that mattered. That's a big, important thing. Yeah. You should probably sleep at some point. I'll sleep when it's done. That's what you always say. He kissed her forehead. Get some rest. I'll call in the morning. He left the hospital at 8:15 and was at his kitchen table with Renata's laptop by 8:45. The LLC names she'd given him were 3 layers of corporate structuring above the underlying property ownership, which was probably deliberate and certainly annoying, but it was navigable. He'd spent 4 years following money through corporate structures. This was slower now, done on an unfamiliar machine at a kitchen table rather than a Bloomberg terminal in a clean office. But the logic was the same. Follow what the money is attached to and find the thing it's attached to. He found the first environmental filing at 1020, a 2022 assessment for a commercial property in the East Industrial District, filed under a Holloway subsidiary. Petroleum hydrocarbon contamination in the soil and groundwater, remediation plan required, estimated remediation cost, $14 million at minimum scope. He kept going. The second filing was for a warehouse property, a different subsidiary, same environmental agency. 2021, chemical solvent contamination. The report language was careful and technical, and buried in it was an estimated remediation figure that made Ethan's jaw tighten. 31 million, minimum scope. The upper estimate was not included in the state filing and would require additional assessment. The third property took him until after midnight to find because it was held through 2 shell companies before it connected to Holloway Industries, and the environmental assessment had been filed under the property address rather than the owner name. When he found it, he sat back in his chair. 44 million. Minimum. The assessor's note said the contamination had spread to adjacent properties and that a comprehensive remediation plan had not yet been filed. 14 plus 31 plus 44, at minimum scope, before any comprehensive assessment of the third property. He sat in his kitchen at 12:30 in the morning and looked at those numbers. Then he thought about the deal as structured, the way those properties were being valued, The fact that none of these filings appeared anywhere in the due diligence materials he'd seen referenced, and the number stopped being a math problem and started being a different kind of thing entirely. Someone had done due diligence on this deal. Someone had looked at these properties and found these assessments because anyone doing basic due diligence would have found them. They weren't hidden. They were public state filings. Which meant the omission from the deal materials wasn't negligence. It was a choice. He opened a blank document on Renata's laptop and started writing. Not the rough memory notes of the morning's legal pad. A structured analysis, but sourced, referenced, organized the way he'd been trained to organize things when they needed to hold up to scrutiny. Each property, each filing, each figure, each citation. He wrote it the way a man writes something he knows might be read by lawyers and judges and people with better resources than he has. And he wrote it carefully and thoroughly, and when he was done at 2:40 in the morning, it was 11 pages long and referenced 12 public documents. He saved it twice and sent a copy to the email address Renata had given him. Then he sat in the quiet of his kitchen and thought about Marcus Webb's face in the reception area, the stillness that was not surprise, and he thought about ARCA advisory and 9 weeks of access, and he thought about Thomas Greer, whose name he'd barely processed at the time, but was now sitting in his mind with a particular weight. He thought about Charlotte Hayes saying, "I trusted my COO," with that flat, careful honesty. He'd been trusted once, too. He knew what it felt like when that turned out to be wrong, the specific quality of that disillusionment, the way it didn't announce itself all at once, but accumulated in small recognitions, each one individually deniable, until suddenly they weren't. He wondered if Charlotte had been having those small recognitions for a while and had been finding ways to explain them away. He suspected she had. He also suspected that she wasn't finding ways to explain them away anymore. She called him at 7 the next morning. He was already awake. He hadn't slept much, a few hours on the couch, and he answered on the second ring. "I have your analysis," she said. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Not softer, Charlotte Hayes didn't do softer, but something had settled in it. "Renata went through it this morning." "And?" "The property at Eastfield Industrial. The third one. The remediation scope." She paused. "Renata pulled the adjacent property filings. The contamination has migrated to 3 other parcels. 2 of them are owned by unrelated parties who haven't filed remediation claims yet, which means the liability exposure once those claims come in could be significantly higher than your estimate." He hadn't had that information. "How much higher?" "We don't know yet. It depends on what the adjacent owners have been tracking." Another pause. "But we have enough. The 3 filings you found are documented public record. The omission from this deal materials is undeniable." A beat. Ethan. It was the first time she'd used his first name. The ARCA advisory access. Renata dug further. The account wasn't set up by Marcus Webb. It was set up by Thomas Greer, but the login credentials were shared with an email domain that belongs to someone on Holloway's board. She said the name carefully. Victor Holloway. James Holloway's brother. He sits on the board but doesn't have an operational role. He has an interest in the deal closing. He has warrants that vest on deal close. They're in a public proxy filing, but they're structured in a way that wasn't disclosed in the materials presented to Vantage's board. A pause. It's a conflict of interest that should have triggered a disclosure. It didn't. Ethan sat with this for a moment. The picture was not getting smaller. It was getting larger and more populated with the specific kind of detail that meant people were going to have to answer questions they'd rather not answer. "Charlotte, how much does Marcus Webb know?" Silence on the line. Longer than the other silences. "I called Marcus this morning," she said finally. "I told him I was postponing the deal pending a full internal review of the integration documentation. I gave him nothing specific. I wanted to see how he responded." "How did he respond?" "He told me I was making a serious mistake. He told me the delay was going to cost Vantage its relationship with Holloway and potentially damage our position with other transaction partners." A pause. "And then he said that if I was acting on information from an unauthorized source, I should be aware that using that information could constitute tortious interference. He's not denying there's something to find." "No," Charlotte said quietly. "He's not." Outside the window of Ethan's apartment, The city was already moving. Buses and deliveries, and the particular morning sound of a neighborhood that doesn't stop. He looked at the stack of printed pages on the table, 12 hours of work, 11 pages of citations and figures, the accumulated evidence of a deal that was not what it had been presented to be. He knows I found something, Ethan said. He knows I found something. He doesn't know yet what you've documented. She paused. He found your name last night. Security report came through with the badge access. He came to me with it this morning before I called him. A beat. He knows you're the night janitor. He's been in contact with someone in HR about your employment record. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. Looking for grounds. Looking for grounds, she confirmed. I want you to know that I have not given him anything about our conversations. As far as Marcus knows, I had a brief exchange with you this morning and sent you away. He won't believe that for long. No, he won't. A pause. This one longer, different in quality. I need to tell you something. He waited. I've been at Vantage for 3 years. I built what this company is, or most of it. I didn't build it by being naive about how deals work or what people are capable of. But I trusted Marcus because he'd been here longer than me and because the results justified the trust, or seemed to. She stopped. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to do is going to be complicated and messy, and I don't want you thinking I don't understand what it costs. What are you about to do? I'm calling the board chair at 9 o'clock. I'm presenting what we have and requesting an emergency meeting. She paused. And I'm filing a voluntary notice with the Financial Regulatory Authority this afternoon documenting the potential fraud and our discovery of it. Another pause. Marcus will know by noon. He'll go after you. He'll try, and you'll lose the deal. The deal was never real, she said, with a flatness that had grief in it somewhere underneath. It was designed to look like a deal. What I'm losing is the version of it I thought I was working on. A beat. I'm losing that regardless. The question is whether I lose it quietly or honestly. He sat with that for a moment. The version of it I thought I was working on. He knew something about that, about the distance between the thing you thought you were part of and the thing it actually was. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to be reachable today. If the board has questions about the financial analysis, I may need to bring you in. I'll be reachable. There's something else. She hesitated in the way she'd hesitated before, the quality of a person who doesn't often hesitate and knows it. Marcus is going to make a move against your employment, probably today. The building services company is contracted through Vantage, which means he has leverage over your supervisor. The thing he'd been not quite thinking about for the past 24 hours sat in his chest and made its weight known. I know. Diana Cho is filing the protective memo this morning. It won't stop him from making the call, but it creates a record that any termination following disclosure was retaliatory. She paused. I'm also asking my board chair to issue a hold on any employment action related to this matter while the internal review is ongoing. I don't know if he'll move fast enough. Charlotte. Yeah. He looked at the pages on his kitchen table. He thought about the thing Diana Cho had said, "You got a bad deal," and about the way he'd answered, "I got the deal I got." He thought about 11 months of nighttime corridors and the particular skill of erasure he'd developed. He thought about 32 years old feeling like a much longer time. Thank you, he said, for moving on it today. You didn't have to do it this fast. She was quiet for a moment. The 72-hour hold expires tomorrow morning. If I don't file today, Holloway's legal team starts asking why I extended. And the longer I wait, the more time Marcus has to get ahead of whatever he thinks I'm doing. A pause. Also, she stopped. Also, it's the right thing to do, she said, in a tone that suggested she found the phrase slightly embarrassing but accurate. $250 million in undisclosed exposure being absorbed by a firm I run, costing 2,300 people their livelihoods, in a deal that was structured to benefit people who already have more than enough. It's the right thing to do. He didn't say anything for a moment. I'll be reachable, he said. Okay? A pause. Ethan, the analysis you sent, the structure of it, the citation methodology, that's not janitor work. He almost said something dismissive. Instead, he said, "I know." "When this is over," she said, "we should probably talk." He wasn't sure exactly what she meant by that. There was more than one way to hear it. And he suspected she meant it to be slightly open-ended, or she'd have said it differently. "When it's over," he agreed. She hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes, looking at nothing in particular. Then he got up and started making coffee, because there was nothing useful he could do in the next hour except wait and be reachable. And the thing about waiting was that you had to do it one moment at a time. His phone buzzed, a text from the hospital number. "Sophie had a good night. Eating breakfast now. She wants to know if the important thing is still going." He typed back, "Still going. Tell her yes." He looked at the coffee brewing, slow and ordinary, and outside the window the city was doing what it always did. Moving, indifferent, full of people who didn't know that on the 42nd floor of a building downtown, something was beginning to come apart in ways that would matter to more lives than any of those people realized. That was always how it worked, he thought. The things that change everything happen in small rooms, on paper, at kitchen tables, in the space between what people say and what they mean. By the time it's visible to everyone, it's already been decided somewhere quiet. He poured his coffee and sat down to wait. The call from his supervisor came at 11:14 in the morning. Ethan had been expecting it since 9, so when his phone lit up with the Meridian Building Services number, he was already sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee gone cold, Diana Cho's card in front of him. The 11-page analysis open on Renata's laptop like a document he'd written in another life. Ethan. His supervisor's name was Gerald Potts, a man in his late 50s who had always been decent to Ethan in the uncomplicated way of people who don't think too hard about the people who work for them. His voice now had an apologetic quality that told Ethan everything before Gerald said the next sentence. "I need you to come in today. Not for a shift. They're asking me to do a meeting." "HR?" A pause. "And someone from Vantage's facilities management. I don't have details, Ethan. They just told me to bring you in." "What time?" 2:00. He called Diana Cho before he'd put his phone down. She picked up on the second ring and said, without preamble, "I saw this coming. Don't go in without me." "You're available at 2? I'll make myself available at 2. The protective memo went through this morning. It's time-stamped and filed. That matters." A pause. "Has Charlotte's board chair issued the employment hold?" "I don't know yet." "Find out. If the hold is in place, this meeting can't legally proceed. If it's not..." She didn't finish the sentence. "Find out." He texted Charlotte. The response came back in 4 minutes, which meant she'd been near her phone. "Board chair is in a governance meeting until noon. I haven't been able to reach him. I'm trying." He sat with that for a minute. Then he texted back. "Meeting at 2 p.m. Meridian HR. Vantage Facilities. 3 minutes. I know. I'll handle it." He wasn't sure what handle it meant from inside a governance meeting on the 42nd floor of a building where her COO was currently, presumably, making calls of his own. But he put the phone down and went to shower and put on the same clean clothes he'd worn yesterday, because they were still the cleanest things he had. Diana met him outside the Meridian Building Services office at 1:50, with a leather folder and the specific expression of a lawyer arriving at a place where she intends to be the most inconvenient person in the room. She looked at him once, checking something, not his clothes, something else, and said, "Did you sleep?" "A little." "You look like you slept a little." She held the door. "Let me do the talking at the start. If they ask you a direct question, answer it simply and stop. Don't explain, don't contextualize. Simple and stop." "I understand." The meeting was in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Meridian Administrative Office, which was a different world from Vantage Capital's 42nd floor in the way that the back of a restaurant is a different world from the dining room. Fluorescent lights. A table that had been nicked in several places. Gerald Potts was already there, looking uncomfortable in his own chair. And across from him were 2 people Ethan didn't know, a woman from Meridian's HR department who introduced herself as Patricia, and a man from Vantage's facilities management whose name was Doyle and who had the settled expression of someone executing instructions rather than exercising judgment. There was a fourth person in the room, Marcus Webb. He hadn't been at the table when they walked in. He was standing near the window with his phone, and he looked up when Ethan entered with the particular steadiness of someone who'd been waiting for this moment and had prepared for it. He was still in the clothes he'd worn at the signing ceremony 2 days ago, or something indistinguishable from them. He looked, Ethan thought, like a man who was very good at appearing calm. Diana Cho clocked him in the same second, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in her posture. Not tenser, more deliberate. She set the leather folder on the table and sat down beside Ethan without acknowledging Webb. "Thank you for coming," Patricia began with the careful phrasing of HR language doing its work. "We wanted to meet today to discuss some concerns that have been raised regarding Mr. Parker's conduct during his employment with Meridian Building Services, specifically relating to activities on the Vantage Capital executive floors. Before we begin," Diana said, "I want to note for the record that Mr. Parker is represented by counsel, that a protective memo establishing the good faith nature of his actions was filed and time-stamped this morning with the relevant regulatory authority, and that we are aware that this meeting has been requested at the instigation of Vantage Capital Management." She looked at Patricia without heat. "Please continue." The HR woman blinked once. Doyle from Facilities looked at Marcus Webb. Webb had not moved from the window. "Mr. Parker," Doyle said, "Vantage Capital has reviewed building access records for the morning of—" "I was there," Ethan said. Diana glanced at him. Simple and stop. He'd gotten ahead of himself. "You accessed the 38th floor of the Vantage Capital building on Tuesday morning without authorization," Doyle said. "Your building services badge provides access to floors 39 through 43 for cleaning purposes only." "That's correct." "Can you explain why you were on the 38th floor?" "I had information I believed was important to a decision that was about to be made by Vantage Capital's CEO." Doyle looked at his folder. "And the night prior, you were on the 42nd floor, which is within your authorized range, but accessed materials that were—" He read a document that was lying open on a conference table in plain sight while performing his assigned cleaning duties, Diana said. He did not remove, copy, or interfere with any document. Reading something you see in the course of your work does not constitute misappropriation. If your argument is otherwise, I'd like to see the specific clause of his employment agreement or the applicable statute that you're intending to invoke. Silence at the table. Marcus Webb moved away from the window and pulled out the chair at the head of the table. He sat down with the ease of someone accustomed to the head of the table and looked at Ethan directly for the first time. "Mr. Parker," he said, "I know who you are." Ethan met his gaze. "Okay. I know what happened at Whitmore and Salk. I know about the settlement and the NDA." He folded his hands on the table, calm, deliberate. "I understand that you've had a difficult several years. I understand that your daughter is ill and that the financial pressures you're under are significant." A pause. "I want to be clear that Vantage Capital has no interest in making your situation worse." Diana said, "That's a curious framing for a meeting you requested." Webb didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Ethan. "What I want you to understand, Mr. Parker, is that whatever Charlotte Hayes may have told you, whatever you believe you saw in that conference room, you are operating outside your area of knowledge. Corporate acquisitions of this scale involve complexities that are not visible from a partial reading of a single document." A beat. "You went through a very damaging experience several years ago, and I think you've brought that experience to what you saw on Tuesday in a way that isn't accurate." Ethan looked at him for a moment. He thought about the state environmental filings. He thought about the version history on the workforce assessment document. He thought about an ARCA advisory login tied to Victor Holloway's email domain that had been active inside Vantage Capital's integration planning for 9 weeks. "Mr. Webb," he said, "I'd like to ask you about ARCA advisory." Something moved in Webb's expression, very small, very fast, and was gone. "That's not relevant to this meeting. It's relevant to why I'm in this meeting." "Ethan," Diana touched his arm briefly. "No." He looked at her, and she held his gaze for a second and then nodded slightly. Some decision made. He looked back at Webb. The workforce assessment document in Vantage's restricted integration folder was modified 4 days before the signing ceremony. The modification was made via an account registered to Arca Advisory, a firm with board-level connections to Holloway Industries. That account had access to your internal planning files for 9 weeks. The access was set up by Thomas Greer. He paused. That's not a traumatized janitor misreading a document. That's a paper trail. Webb's face had gone very still. Patricia from HR was looking at her folder as if she wished she were somewhere else. Gerald Potts, who had no context for any of this, was looking at his hands. Doyle from Facilities had the expression of a man who'd come to conduct a routine termination meeting and found himself in a different kind of room entirely. This meeting, Webb said, with a control that was costing him something, is about your unauthorized access to executive floors and materials. And the meeting Charlotte Hayes called with the board chair this morning, Ethan said, is about everything else. He looked at Webb steadily. Which one do you think matters more? Webb stood up. The movement was controlled, but it was still an exit. He looked at Doyle. Process the termination. He looked at Ethan one last time. Not with anger, with something colder, and walked out. The room was quiet for a moment. Diana picked up her pen. Patricia, I'd like to discuss the timing and grounds for this termination because any action taken against Mr. Parker within 48 hours of his reporting potential fraud to executive leadership is going to be characterized as retaliation, and I want to make sure Meridian Building Services understands what that exposure looks like. She said it pleasantly, the way people say unpleasant things when they've had practice. Shall we? He was suspended, not terminated, the distinction apparently mattering enough to Patricia that she'd pushed back on Doyle after Webb left. Suspended pending investigation, with pay, which Diana told him afterward was a meaningful concession. They blinked, she said on the sidewalk outside. Webb expected this to be cleaner. It's not clean, Ethan said. No, but you're not fired. That matters. She looked at him. Charlotte's board meeting. Do you know what's happening? His phone buzzed as she said it. Not Charlotte. Renata. Board meeting is happening now. Charlotte presented the full analysis. It's bad in there. Webb showed up uninvited and it got loud. Stay available. He showed it to Diana, who read it and exhaled through her nose. Go home, she said. Stay near your phone. Don't talk to press if anyone calls. And someone may call. These things leak. She paused. You did well in there. I got Webb to leave. You got Webb to leave by saying something true in a room full of people he needed to believe his version. That's harder than it sounds. She squeezed his shoulder once, brief and practical, and walked away toward the parking garage. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The afternoon was gray, a particular city gray that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite not. He thought about going to the hospital. He thought about Sophie's question. Is the important thing still going? His phone rang. Charlotte. Where are you? She said. Outside the Meridian office. It's done. Suspended, not fired. Diana held the line. Good. Her voice was compressed, the way voices get when something large is happening close by. The board meeting has been running for 2 hours. It's not going smoothly. Webb came in with legal counsel and is characterizing the investigation as a breach of the CEO's fiduciary duty and an attempt to unilaterally collapse a deal without board approval. A pause. He has 2 board members who are sympathetic to that framing. Both of them have existing business relationships with Holloway Industries that weren't disclosed when they were appointed to the committee overseeing this acquisition. Conflicts of interest on the board? Yes. A beat. Ethan, I need the full analysis, the original document. I have Renata's copy, but the board chair wants the primary source. I can be there in 30 minutes. A pause. There are people in this building right now who want you arrested. I know. Another pause, longer. Come to the 41st floor. I'll have security hold a pass for you. She paused. Don't come through the service entrance. He almost said something about that. Instead, he said, I'll be there in 30 minutes, and hung up. The 41st floor looked different in the afternoon with a board meeting happening. There were people in the corridors who weren't usually there, legal staff, a communications consultant, 2 men in the particular suits that meant outside counsel. The air had the charged quality of an institution in the middle of something it hadn't planned for. Charlotte met him at the elevator herself, which he hadn't expected. She looked like someone who'd been in a room with difficult people for 2 hours and hadn't let it show yet, but was getting close to the limit. Her hair had one strand out of place. He noticed it and then noticed himself noticing it. "The 2 board members," she said without preamble, walking him toward the boardroom. "Harlan Jenks and Petra Stein. Both have financial advisory relationships with Holloway's private office. Neither disclosed this when they were appointed to the Acquisition Oversight Committee." She was walking fast, and he matched her. "The board chair is aware now. He's not pleased." "What does the rest of the board look like?" 7 other members. 5 are with me. 1 is uncertain. 1 I can't read." She glanced at him sideways. "The majority is there? The question is whether Webb's legal argument about fiduciary duty gains enough traction to table the regulatory filing. If you table the filing, the deal window stays open. Holloway's team can restructure, disclose the liabilities properly, come back with a revised offer." She paused. "Which is not what anyone who structured this deal wants. Because a deal with proper disclosure doesn't close at the same valuation. No, it closes at a much lower number, or it doesn't close at all." She stopped outside the boardroom doors. "The regulatory filing is the key. Once I file, the deal is effectively dead and the fraud investigation begins. Webb knows this. He's trying to stop the filing, not save the deal." She looked at Ethan directly. "He's trying to protect himself." The boardroom had 12 people in it, which was more than Ethan had expected. The board members, 7 seated at the main table, 2 conspicuously separated toward the far end, along with the board chair, a man in his 70s named Cyrus Halpert, who had the look of someone who had seen many difficult days and had opinions about this one. Webb was seated at the side of the table with a lawyer Ethan didn't recognize. Renata was there, laptop open, and Thomas Greer was there, which Ethan had not anticipated. Greer was in his late 40s, the head of transaction structuring, a man whose photograph Ethan had found in a Vantage press release at some point in the last 2 days. He looked, in person, like a man who'd been sitting with a difficult secret for long enough that the effort of containing it had changed his face. He was not looking at Webb. He was looking at his hands. Ethan had seen that look before. He'd worn it himself once in a conference room at Whitmore and Salk, while people around him decided how to characterize what he'd found. Charlotte set the printed analysis on the table in front of Cyrus Halpert. "The environmental filings are documented public record. The version history on the workforce assessment is in Renata's documentation. The ARCA advisory access log is in the restricted integration folder." She looked at the board. "This is not a question of interpretation. The undisclosed liabilities are real. The deal materials presented to this board were incomplete." A pause. "The question before this meeting is not whether to approve the deal. The deal is not approvable as structured. The question is whether we file today or delay." Webb's lawyer said, "The question before this meeting is whether Ms. Hayes has the unilateral authority to file a voluntary regulatory disclosure without board approval, and whether her decision to involve an unauthorized outside party in the review of confidential materials constitutes a breach of—" "Thomas," Charlotte said. Greer looked up. The room went quiet in a particular way. Charlotte was looking at Greer with an expression that wasn't quite accusation and wasn't quite appeal. It was something more complicated, the look of a person who has worked beside someone and is now standing on the other side of a line and knows it. "Thomas, tell the board what you told me this morning," Webb said sharply. "Thomas, tell them," Charlotte said. Greer looked at Webb, then at Halpert, then at his hands again, and then at Charlotte, and whatever internal calculation he'd been running reached its conclusion in the silence of that room with 12 people in it. "The ARCA advisory access was my action," he said. His voice was steady in the way of a man reading something he'd rehearsed. "I provided credentials to Victor Holloway's office at Marcus Webb's request 6 weeks before the deal was announced publicly. The purpose was to allow Holloway's team to review and to adjust certain projections in our integration model in advance of the board presentation." A pause. "I knew the adjustments were material. I proceeded because I was told the deal was in Vantage's interest, and the adjustments were within normal deal structuring parameters." He stopped. "They were not within normal parameters. I've known that for some time." The room had the quality of absolute silence that happens after something irreversible. Webb was on his feet. "Cyrus." "Sit down, Marcus," Halpert said. He said it quietly, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it loudly. Webb sat down. Halpert looked at the analysis on the table in front of him, then at Ethan, who was standing slightly behind and to the right of Charlotte. The board chair looked at him the way old men look at unexpected things, with more curiosity than the situation seemed to warrant. "You're the building services employee," he said. "Yes, sir." "Charlotte tells me the environmental analysis is your work. It's based on public filings. The analysis is mine." Halpert looked at him for another moment. "You used to work in finance." "A long time ago." "Evidently not long enough to forget how." He picked up the analysis, looked at the first page, set it down. He looked at Charlotte. "File the disclosure today, this afternoon." He looked at Webb. "And Marcus, I'd strongly suggest you speak with your counsel before you say anything else in this room." Ethan left the boardroom while the procedural conversation was still ongoing. Charlotte had signaled him with a slight tilt of her head, the unspoken communication of people who've been operating in parallel long enough to develop shorthand. He went to the waiting area on the 41st floor, the same chairs where he'd sat 2 days ago, and he sat down and looked at his phone and tried to organize what he was feeling into something manageable. His phone showed a missed call from a number he didn't recognize and a voicemail. He played it. "Mr. Parker, this is Detective Alicia Voss from the Financial Crimes Unit. We've received a regulatory disclosure from Vantage Capital Group this afternoon, and your name appears in the accompanying documentation. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience." A number. "Thank you." He sat with the phone in his hands. Then he called Diana Cho. She answered immediately. "I know, they called me too." "This is good, Ethan. The regulatory filing puts law enforcement in front of this before Webb can get any further ahead of it." A pause. "It also means you're a witness, not a suspect. That's a very different position. They might still pursue the unauthorized access." "They might, but it's going to be a hard argument to make when you're the person who helped expose a fraud of this magnitude." A beat. "How are you holding up?" He thought about the question honestly. "I don't know yet." "That's fair." A pause. "Go see your daughter. There's nothing else you can do today, and you've done enough." He sat for another minute after she hung up. Through the glass wall of the waiting area, he could see the corridor, and beyond it, the elevator bank. And beyond that, the part of the floor he couldn't see from here but knew. The conference rooms, the executive kitchen he'd cleaned every night for 11 months. The particular quality of a floor that looked like one thing from outside and was another thing once you knew what happened there. He heard footsteps. Charlotte came out of the boardroom corridor and walked to where he was sitting. She looked tired in a way that was new. Not the controlled fatigue of before, but something that had gotten through whatever she usually kept it behind. She sat down in the chair next to him, not across, which he noticed. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "It's filed," she said. "I heard." Webb is on administrative leave effective immediately, pending the regulatory investigation. The board chair invoked the emergency governance provision. She paused. "Greer has agreed to cooperate with the investigation." Greer made the right call. Eventually. She was looking at the far wall. He made it when he didn't have any other options. That's not quite the same thing. "No, but it's something." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been running a company for 3 years. I've made hard calls. I've fired people I liked and promoted people who made me uncomfortable, and I've made decisions that cost something and I thought I understood the cost." She stopped. "I didn't understand this particular cost." He looked at her profile. Tired, precise, honest in the way of a person who's not performing honesty, but just telling the truth because it's less work than the other thing. He thought about the version of Charlotte Hayes he'd had in his head before Tuesday morning. The photograph CEO, the biographical data, the external-facing woman who ran Vantage Capital and didn't need to be liked. He thought she was different from that version. He was aware that he had only known her for 50 hours. "What happens now?" he said. "The regulatory investigation runs its course. The deal is dead. Webb will be subject to whatever comes out of the investigation, along with Greer and likely Victor Holloway." She paused. The board will have decisions to make about leadership going forward. What kind of decisions? She looked at him then, with an expression that had something in it that was difficult to name, not resignation, something that had accepted something difficult and moved past the shock of it. The kind that usually involve a CEO who disrupted a major acquisition and filed a regulatory complaint against her own COO. A beat. The board was supportive today. Tomorrow they'll be thinking about institutional damage and investor relations. They might move against you. They might. She held his gaze. That's tomorrow's problem. He thought about saying something reassuring and decided against it because she hadn't asked for reassurance and he didn't think she wanted it. Does it feel worth it? She looked at him for a moment. Ask me in a week. A pause. Right now it mostly feels like my hands are shaking a little and I haven't eaten since this morning. She looked at her hands, which were in her lap, and indeed not entirely steady. She seemed faintly surprised by this, as though her hands had acted without her permission. There's a sandwich place around the corner, he said. They stay open until 8. She looked at him. He wasn't sure, when he'd said it, exactly what he'd been offering. Whether it was just information or something more, some acknowledgement of the particular strangeness of having been in each other's proximity for 50 hours across the most consequential 2 days either of them had had in recent memory. Okay, she said. It wasn't a declaration, it was just a word. But she stood up, and he stood up, and they walked toward the elevator, and the building moved around them the way buildings do. Indifferent, continuous, carrying on with all the other things it was. Outside on the sidewalk, the city gray afternoon had shifted while they were inside. It had started, finally, to rain. Not hard, just the light persistent rain that the city did in early fall, the kind that doesn't bother anyone much and doesn't stop anything. Charlotte turned her collar up. Ethan didn't have a collar to turn up. Left, she said about the sandwich place. Left, he confirmed. They turned left, and the rain came down on both of them equally, and neither of them said anything for the half block it took to get there. He checked his phone one last time before they went inside. A text from the hospital. She drew another horse. Says, this one looks more like a horse? She wants your opinion. He put the phone in his pocket and held the door open. He'd see the horse tonight and give his honest opinion, which was going to be that it looked like a horse, because he suspected this time it actually would. The sandwich place on the corner of Clement and 4th was called Marty's, and it had 8 tables, a handwritten menu on a chalkboard, and the particular warmth of a small restaurant that had been in the same location long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. Charlotte Hayes had almost certainly never been inside it before. She looked at the menu board with the focused attention of someone who'd been making decisions all day, and found that ordering a sandwich required a moment. The turkey, Ethan said. The bread is better than it looks. She ordered the turkey. He ordered the same thing he always ordered when he could afford it, which was a cup of soup and whatever the daily special was. They sat at the table near the window, where the rain made a low, continuous sound against the glass, and ate mostly in silence for the first 10 minutes. The comfortable kind of silence that happens when 2 people are too depleted for conversation and have decided that's acceptable. Charlotte ate about half her sandwich and then put it down and looked at him. You didn't tell me your daughter's name. Sophie. How old? 7. 8 in March. She nodded slowly, looking at the table. What's wrong with her? If that's not, it's not a problem. He wrapped both hands around the soup cup. She has a pulmonary condition. Chronic, manageable with treatment. The treatment is expensive. He paused. It's working. That's the important part. Charlotte looked at him with an expression that wasn't pity. He was alert enough to the difference by now to catch that quickly. But something more direct than sympathy. Just attention. Does she know what you've been doing this week? She knows I've been doing something important. What did you tell her it was? He almost smiled. I told her I saw something I wasn't supposed to see and I had to tell someone about it. The corner of Charlotte's mouth moved. How did she respond? She asked if it could get me in trouble. He paused. I said hopefully not. She pointed out that hopefully was not the same as no. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She sounds like she pays attention. She pays attention to everything. It's exhausting, and I wouldn't change it. Charlotte picked up her sandwich again and looked at it and then set it back down. I'm not good at this, she said, with the precision of someone naming something accurately rather than making an excuse. Sitting in a restaurant talking about personal things. I do the other kind of talking, the boardroom kind. I noticed. Is that a criticism? No, it's an observation. He looked at her. You were good in that room today. You had Greer before he knew you had him. I knew Greer was carrying something for weeks. Every time the deal projections came back revised after I'd questioned them, he was the person who brought them to me. Never Marcus, always Thomas. Marcus would send Thomas. She paused. At the time, I thought it was because Thomas was the detail person. Later, I thought it was because Marcus was being careful about documentation. He was keeping distance between himself and the revisions. Yes. She looked at the window. The rain had gotten slightly heavier. I should have seen it sooner. I told myself the projections were optimistic but not dishonest. That's the version I wanted. She said the last sentence flatly, without self-pity, the way people admit things to themselves out loud for the first time. I wanted the deal to be real. It was a good deal, the version I thought it was. It would have been the biggest acquisition in Vantage's history. You built something worth wanting to grow. She glanced at him. Don't. Don't what? Don't make it more generous than it is. I wanted the deal partly because it was mine, because I designed the strategy and I wanted to see it close. She looked at the table. That's not noble. It made me slower to see what was wrong. He thought about this, about the specific human failure of wanting something badly enough to interpret ambiguous evidence in its favor. He'd done the same thing once, not about a deal, but about the people he'd worked for. He'd wanted them to be the version he'd thought they were. It doesn't make you the villain, he said. I know that. It still matters. She picked up her coffee. What happened to you at Whitmore? Did you ever stop wanting the version you thought it was? The question landed more precisely than he expected. He sat with it for a moment. No, he said, honestly. I kept thinking there was a version where someone would acknowledge it and fix it, even after they fired me, even during the settlement. He paused. It took a while to accept that the version I thought it was never real. How long? Longer than I'd like to admit. She looked at him steadily. And now? Now I've had long enough with the real version that it's just the version. He shrugged slightly. You stop needing it to be something else eventually. Charlotte Hayes looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once, the way her expressions often were, processing, weighing, landing somewhere that wasn't immediately visible. Then she looked away, at the rain, at nothing specific. The board meets on Monday, she said. It was a change of subject and not a change of subject at the same time. Halpert was supportive today. He may be less supportive on Monday when his phone has had the weekend to fill up with calls from institutional investors and deal partners who are unhappy about the collapse. She paused. Jenks and Stein aren't going anywhere before Monday. They're still board members. Can they move against you before the regulatory investigation concludes? They can initiate a review of my leadership decisions. They can't remove me unilaterally, but they can create enough noise to make the board chair's position uncomfortable. A beat. And if the investigation takes the shape I expect it to take, the argument will be that I destabilized the company by acting unilaterally on information from an unauthorized source. They'll make me the argument. You and my judgment in trusting you. She said it without apology or qualification. That's what this becomes. Not whether the fraud was real. The fraud is documented. That's settled. The question becomes whether Charlotte Hayes made sound institutional decisions and how she responded to it. He understood the shape of it clearly. He'd seen the same shape before, in a smaller room, about a smaller amount of money, with the same fundamental structure. The wrongdoing becomes the backdrop, and the response to it becomes the subject. The people who did the thing move off center, and the person who uncovered it moves to the middle. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. For what? That this is the version of being right that you get. She was quiet for a moment. The rain kept doing what rain does. Steady, unconcerned. A couple came in from outside, shaking water off a shared umbrella, and took the table near the door. When I was 26, Charlotte said, I wrote an analysis for the firm I was working for that my supervisor rejected. He said it was too aggressive in its assumptions. He presented a version to the client that had my structure and his numbers. She looked at her coffee. The deal they recommended closed. 18 months later, it had lost the client 40% of their position. My original numbers were right. She paused. I never worked for that firm again, obviously, but I spent a year wondering if being right was worth what it cost. She looked at him. I stopped wondering eventually. What made you stop? I got tired of the question. A pause. And I got a better job. Oh, she almost smiled, but not quite, but close. Sometimes the thing that follows the cost is just better. He looked at her. He was aware, sitting in this unremarkable restaurant on a rainy afternoon, that something was shifting between them in a way that had nothing to do with the deal or the board or the regulatory filing. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens when two people have been through something difficult together and are sitting on the other side of it and are surprised to find that the other person is still there and still real. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't think either of them was ready to say anything about it. Eat the rest of your sandwich, he said instead. She looked down at it. It is good bread. I told you. Monday arrived the way difficult days do, unremarkably, preceded by a weekend that had the specific quality of time that doesn't rest even when it's not moving. Ethan spent Saturday with Sophie, who was having a good day and whose second horse drawing did, in fact, look considerably more like a horse. He told her so, and she received the verdict with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in eventual improvement had been vindicated. He spent Sunday doing laundry and not thinking about the board meeting and thinking about it anyway. Charlotte texted him on Sunday evening. Board meeting, 9 a.m. Halpert called this afternoon. The conversation was careful in a way that wasn't encouraging. He texted back, "How are you?" A pause, longer than the others. Tired. Ready. Same thing lately. Call me after. Another pause. Okay. He didn't sleep well. He woke at 5:30 and gave up trying at 6 and sat at his kitchen table with the legal pad, which he'd taken to keeping there, not because he needed it, but because it had become a kind of object, the way things become objects when they've been through something with you. His phone rang at 11:47. They voted, Charlotte said. Her voice was level in the particular way that voices are level after a decision has been made, and there's no further use in being anything other than clear about it. 5-4. The board is requesting my resignation pending a full review of my leadership decisions related to the acquisition process and the regulatory filing. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the neighborhood was doing its ordinary Monday things, indifferent. Charlotte? It's not a removal. It's a request, technically. But Halpert made it clear that contesting it would be a lengthy process and would be characterized publicly as a CEO refusing accountability, which is, that's a losing position regardless of the underlying facts. She paused. Jenks had been making calls all weekend. He brought 3 arguments to the meeting: unauthorized outside consultation, unilateral regulatory action, and destabilization of a major transaction. Halpert pushed back on all 3 and lost on the last one. The deal destabilization argument. The investors are not happy. 2 major institutional holders called the board directly over the weekend. They lost value in the deal collapse, and they want someone to be accountable for that. A beat. I collapsed the deal. I'm the accountable party. The deal was fraud. The deal was fraud that hadn't technically harmed anyone yet. The collapse harmed the investors in real time. She said it without bitterness. Just the flat acknowledgement of how these things worked, of the specific way that preventing harm in advance was harder to credit than repairing it afterward. The regulatory investigation will eventually establish what would have happened to those investors if the deal had closed with the undisclosed liabilities. Eventually, a pause. These things take time. What are you going to do? Silence for a moment. I'm going to take the afternoon to sit with it. Then I'm going to decide. Another pause. I'm not going to fight the request. Fighting it means 12 months of institutional politics while the company is in a regulatory process, and that's bad for everyone, including the people who work here. She stopped. It's also just, I'm tired. I'm tired of that particular kind of fight. He understood that. He'd been tired of that particular kind of fight for 3 years. Ethan. Her voice changed slightly. Still level, but something in it that was reaching toward something. The regulatory investigators called me this morning before the board meeting. They've moved the investigation to formal status. Webb, Greer, and Victor Holloway are all being examined. The investigators also said, a pause. They said the Paragon Energy case has been referred to the relevant authorities for a supplementary review based on structural similarities to the Holloway fraud. He was very still. Your NDA, she said. Diana thinks the supplementary review may provide grounds to challenge the enforceability of it, given that the underlying conduct it was designed to protect has now been independently established as part of a pattern. A beat. That's not my read. It's hers. But she wanted you to know. He sat with this for a moment that was longer than it appeared from the outside. I know that's not... Charlotte paused. I know it doesn't fix everything. The years are still the years. No, he said. It doesn't fix everything. A beat. It fixes some things. She was quiet. He was quiet. The connection stayed open, neither of them filling it. I meant what I said on Friday, she said finally, about when this is over. He'd been thinking about it since she'd said it. He'd been thinking about it the way you think about something you're not ready to address directly, but can't quite put down. I know. I don't entirely know what I meant, she said, with a precision that was very Charlotte, the willingness to be accurate about the limits of her own certainty. I meant something. I'm not sure what shape it takes yet. That's okay, he said. Is it? Yes. He paused. Neither of us is in a shape right now where the next thing is clear. That's probably okay. A small pause. You're more patient than I am. I've had more practice waiting. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that vicinity. I'll call you later this week after I've talked to Diana about the next steps. A beat. And Ethan, tell Sophie the important thing finished. How should I say it finished? Charlotte Hayes, who had just been asked to resign from the company she'd built, who had lost a $300 million deal and her professional position in the same week, was quiet for a moment. Then, tell her the right people know the truth now. That's enough for today. He sat with his phone after she hung up, in the kitchen where he'd done most of his thinking for the last several days, at the table with the legal pad and the cold coffee, and he let himself feel the weight of it. Not dramatically, just honestly. The cost was real. Charlotte's cost was real. His was real. You didn't get to acknowledge doing the right thing without also acknowledging what it took. He picked up his phone and called the hospital. She's in the therapy room, the nurse said. Can I give her a message? Tell her the important thing finished, he said, and tell her I'll be there for dinner. He was terminated from Meridian Building Services by letter on Wednesday. The letter cited the unauthorized access to the 38th floor and characterized his suspension as grounds for dismissal under the terms of his employment agreement. Diana Cho called it weak and actionable. He called it expected. The thing about losing the job was that it was less catastrophic than he'd thought it would be, and he wasn't sure whether that was because he'd been preparing for it all week or because the week had recalibrated what catastrophic felt like. Sophie's insurance was covered through the end of the following month. That was the number that mattered. 6 weeks. He sat with 6 weeks and tried to make a plan, and making a plan was harder than it used to be because the landscape had changed in ways he hadn't fully mapped yet. He was, technically, a person who'd been publicly identified. Not prominently, but in the financial press coverage of the Vantage Capital regulatory disclosure, as having provided the analysis that triggered the investigation. That was a different kind of exposure than he'd had for the last 3 years. It was also, Diana pointed out, a different kind of credential. You have a public record now, she said when they talked on Wednesday evening. Not the version from Whitmore, a new one. You identified a multi-hundred-million-dollar fraud from public records in a partial document read at midnight. That's a story. I don't know what to do with a story. You don't have to know yet. Just let it be true for a while. He let it be true. He spent Thursday at the hospital, longer than usual, because Sophie was in a good stretch, and the good stretches had a specific quality he'd learned not to take for granted. The lightness of them, the way she was more herself during them, fully present and unguarded. She showed him the second horse, which had been joined by a third horse and two dogs that she'd drawn separately and then decided belonged in the same picture. "Is that a family?" he asked. "Obviously," she said. "The dogs and the horses are a family?" "Why not?" She looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something self-evident. "They're all in the picture together. That makes them a family." He looked at the drawing for a moment. "That's a reasonable definition." "I know." He took the drawing home and put it on the kitchen table next to the legal pad. On Friday, Charlotte called. "I've been talking to some people," she said. Her voice had a different quality than the Monday call. Still tired, but thinking tired rather than depleted tired. The difference was notable. "There's a gap in the market that I've been aware of for a while. Smaller companies, mid-market, that need sophisticated financial oversight but can't afford a full institutional advisory structure. They end up with bad deals or no deals or advisors who aren't aligned with their interests." She paused. "I've been thinking about building something in that space." He was quiet, listening. Ethical investment advisory. Not as a tagline, as an actual operational principle. Transparent fee structures, conflict of interest disclosure built into the engagement model, analysis that goes to the client rather than being structured around the deal closing. She paused. "I know what doesn't work. I've spent 3 years watching what doesn't work from the inside of a firm that did a lot of it." Another pause. "I'd need a co-founder with a background in quantitative analysis." He sat very still. "Charlotte, I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to think about it." Her voice was precise and careful in the way that meant she'd been thinking about how to say this for a while. "You have the analytical background. You understand the specific ways these deals get structured to benefit the wrong people. You have a perspective that I don't have about what this kind of thing costs at the level where it actually costs people something." A beat. "I have the capital and the network and the institutional knowledge of how to build a firm. I was a night janitor 3 weeks ago. You were a Wall Street analyst who'd been forced into a different position for reasons that are now part of a regulatory investigation." She paused. "That's a different sentence." He looked at the kitchen table, the legal pad, the horse and dog drawing, the letter from Meridian Building Services that he hadn't moved because he hadn't figured out where it belonged yet. "Sophie's insurance runs through next month," he said. "I know. I've been in contact with Dr. Reyes's office. The treatment program Sophie is in has a patient advocacy fund that covers continuous care for children in active treatment when family insurance status changes. Renata found it." A pause. "Sophie is already eligible. It just needed to be applied for." He closed his eyes briefly. "I should have told you sooner," Charlotte said. "I only got confirmation yesterday. I didn't want to tell you before I was sure." He sat with this, with the specific weight of it, the relief and the other thing that came with it, the feeling of being seen in the most practical and human way, of someone looking at your actual problem and doing the actual thing rather than offering the gesture of concern. "You called Dr. Reyes's office," he said. "Renata did. I asked her to." "Why?" A pause. "Because Sophie should be able to get better without her father spending the whole time terrified about whether the insurance holds." She said it simply, without making it larger than it was. That seemed like the minimum. He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was very still. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking." The co-founder conversation is a separate conversation. The insurance is separate from everything else. There are no strings. She said it with a firmness that brooked nothing. "I want to be clear about that." "I know." He did know. That was the thing about Charlotte Hayes that had become clear somewhere in the last week, somewhere between the boardroom and the sandwich place and the Monday phone call, that she was direct in the specific way of people who've spent a long time in rooms full of indirection and have developed a preference for its absence. "I know there are no strings." "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. A pause, the comfortable kind. "How's Sophie this week?" Charlotte asked. "Good week. She's in a good stretch." He looked at the drawing on the table. "She made a drawing, horses and dogs. She says they're a family because they're all in the same picture together." A small silence. "That's a good definition," I thought so too. Tell her. Charlotte stopped, and he heard her deciding something on the other side of the call. Tell her, I said, the horses look great. He almost said she hadn't seen the horses, but he didn't, because it was the kind of thing you didn't correct. I will, he said. They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular, about the regulatory timeline, about Renata, who was apparently staying on through the transition, about a conversation Charlotte had had with Cyrus Halpert that had been more human than their board meeting conversation, and had left her feeling something she couldn't quite characterize. They talked the way people talk when they've been through something together, and are on the other side of it, finding out what the other side contains. After they hung up, he sat for a while. He thought about the version of his life from 3 weeks ago, the midnight corridors, the specific tiredness, the particular skill of erasure. He thought about the version of himself that had stepped out of the service elevator on the 42nd floor on a Tuesday night and seen a light left on in a conference room and gone in to clean it. He thought about what Sophie had said. They're all in the same picture together. That makes them a family. And about the drawing on the table with the horses and dogs. And about the way things that started as one thing sometimes ended as a different, more complicated, better thing without announcing the transition. He'd lost the job. That was real. Charlotte had lost her position. That was also real. The cost was real, and it would continue to be real for a while. In the weeks of figuring things out, in the uncertainty that preceded whatever came next, in the things that didn't resolve cleanly because they never do. But Sophie's insurance was covered. The people who'd built the fraud were being examined by people with the authority to do something about it. The 2,300 jobs that would have been cut without disclosure. Their people didn't know what hadn't happened to them, and probably never would, and that was fine. Truth had a cost. He'd always known that. He'd paid it once before and hadn't gotten much in return. This time felt different, though he was careful with that feeling. Careful not to make more of it than it was. Not to construct a neater story than the facts supported. He picked up the drawing of the horses and dogs. He thought, they're all in the picture. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the early evening, the particular ambient sound of people finishing the workday and moving toward whatever came next. Ordinary and continuous. He'd cleaned the floors of buildings where that sound was muffled by 40 stories of glass and corporate carpeting, and he'd moved through those buildings invisible, and he'd seen things that people hadn't expected him to see. That was the thing about being invisible. You saw everything. He put the drawing back on the table and went to get ready for the hospital visit. He had a dinner to make it to. The office they rented for the first 3 months was not impressive. It was on the 4th floor of a building on Merchant Street that smelled like old carpet and the coffee from the Vietnamese place on the ground floor, and it had 2 desks, one window that faced a brick wall, and a radiator that made a sound like someone occasionally tapping a pipe with a spoon. Charlotte had looked at it the first day and said, "It has good bones," which Ethan suspected was something people said about spaces that didn't have much else to recommend them. He'd said, "It has a lock on the door and electrical outlets," and she'd said, "Exactly," and they'd signed the lease. That was in January, 4 months after the board meeting. 3 months after Marcus Webb was formally charged with securities fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, charges that had come down on a Thursday afternoon with a press release that Ethan had read sitting in the hospital cafeteria while Sophie was in her afternoon treatment session. Thomas Greer had pled to a lesser charge in exchange for his cooperation, which was what cooperation usually looked like. You got there eventually, and what you got in exchange depended on how useful you turned out to be. Victor Holloway's case was still pending, moving through the legal system at the pace legal systems moved, which was not a pace Ethan had any control over. The Paragon Energy Supplementary Review had taken 11 weeks. Diana Cho had called him on a Wednesday morning in December to tell him the results. The review had established sufficient independent basis to determine that Ethan's original findings had been accurate and that his termination had been retaliatory, a fact that had been obscured by the settlement and NDA but was now part of the public regulatory record. The NDA, as Diana had predicted, had been found unenforceable in the specific provisions that had limited his ability to discuss the underlying facts. He could say what he knew. He could use what he knew. He'd sat with the phone after that call, the way he'd sat with a lot of things over the past year, quietly, at the kitchen table, with the legal pad nearby. The table had become his thinking place. He'd bought a better chair. The thing about being exonerated, he'd discovered, was that it didn't feel the way you imagined it would when you were in the worst of what had happened. It didn't feel like a door opening or a weight lifting or any of the metaphors that people used for relief. It felt more like a fact becoming accurate, like the record catching up to what had always been true. It felt like a correction, not a victory. He'd thought about this for a while and decided that was probably the right way for it to feel. Some things didn't deserve to be victories. Some things just deserved to be correct. The morning he told Sophie, she'd looked at him with her particular 7-year-old gravity and said, "So the people who said you did something wrong were wrong?" "Yes. And now everyone knows?" "The official record knows." She considered this. "Does it feel better?" He thought about it honestly. "It feels different," he said. It's complicated." "Complicated is fine," she said, with the pragmatism of someone who'd spent the better part of a year in a hospital and had developed a working relationship with complicated. "Different is okay." He'd hugged her then, which she tolerated for a respectful amount of time before extracting herself and returning to the drawing she'd been working on. The name of the company was Meridian Advisory Partners, which Charlotte had proposed with a straight face, and Ethan had pointed out was the name of the building services company that had fired him, and Charlotte had said, "I know, I thought it was appropriate." And he'd thought about it for a moment and then agreed because she was right in the way she was often right, unexpected and precise. The idea behind it was not complicated, which Charlotte said deliberately. Complicated ideas were how bad deals got sold. The pitch was this: mid-market companies, businesses doing between 20 and 200 million in annual revenue, needed the same quality of financial analysis and advisory that large corporations got from institutional firms. But the institutional firms weren't interested in them because the fees didn't scale. So those companies ended up either underserved or served by advisors whose interests weren't aligned with theirs. Meridian Advisory Partners would serve them exclusively with full conflict of interest disclosure, flat fee structures that didn't depend on deal outcomes, and analysis that went to the client. "The business model only works," Charlotte had said during one of their early January planning sessions, "if we're actually right more often than not. That's most business models. Most business models have enough margin to be wrong sometimes without anyone noticing." She'd looked at the whiteboard she'd set up in the corner of the Merchant Street office. "Ours doesn't. Our entire value proposition is that we tell clients things they can trust. One bad call we didn't disclose properly, and we're done." "That's a high standard." "Yes." She'd looked at him. "Can you work to that standard?" He'd looked back at her. "Can you?" She'd held his gaze for a moment. "Yes." "Then yes." They'd both looked at the whiteboard, which had the company structure and the first 3 months of operating projections, and neither of them had said what was obvious: that they were both people who'd paid large costs for exactly that standard, and that building a business around it was either the most logical thing they could do or the most naive, and the difference between those two things would only be clear in hindsight. Renata Ose joined them in February. She'd been offered positions at 2 other firms after Vantage dissolved its senior analytical team, and she'd turned both down. And when Charlotte had called her in late January, she'd said, "I've been waiting for you to ask," which Charlotte had told Ethan about afterward with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and mild embarrassment. Renata brought the precision that the operation needed. She had a specific kind of intelligence that ran parallel to Ethan's, where he thought in narrative structure, in the story a set of numbers was telling. She thought in architecture, in the underlying framework that held the story up or failed to. Together they could read a financial structure from 2 different angles at the same time, which turned out to be more valuable than either could have predicted. Charlotte brought the network, the institutional knowledge, and the specific skill of walking into a room full of people with money and not being overwhelmed by it. The 3 of them were not always easy together. Charlotte and Ethan had different instincts about risk tolerance. She tended toward the move, he tended toward the wait. And they argued about it with a directness that Renata observed with the neutrality of someone taking notes. Charlotte had a habit of making decisions before she'd fully articulated her reasoning, and Ethan had a habit of articulating his reasoning until Charlotte said, "I understand, Ethan, you can stop." which she said with a frequency that became a kind of shorthand between them. Renata had an opinion about most things and expressed it in complete sentences without being asked, which was both occasionally inconvenient and generally correct. They figured it out. That was the least romantic way to say it, and also the most accurate. They figured it out the way people figure out how to work together, through the accumulated small decisions about who deferred to whom on which kind of thing, about how to have the argument and then close it and move forward, about when being right mattered more than the relationship, and when the relationship mattered more than being right. They got it wrong sometimes. They said things they had to walk back. They had a conversation in March about a client engagement that Ethan thought they should decline and Charlotte thought they should take. That got loud enough that the tenant on the third floor knocked on the ceiling with something. They declined the engagement. Charlotte had been right that it was the kind of work they needed, and Ethan had been right that the client's culture of internal disclosure was insufficient for the kind of engagement they'd be promising. The disagreement, once they'd resolved it, produced a new section of their client intake criteria that both of them thought was better than what either would have come up with alone. That was February through April. The mechanics of building something, the unglamorous operational reality of it. And in the middle of all of it, there was also this. The other thing, the thing that neither of them had named directly during the Monday phone call, or the sandwich place, or the subsequent months of professional construction, but that existed in the space between them with the particular weight of something both people are aware of, and neither is in a hurry to handle badly. It was Sophie who said something first. This was not entirely surprising. Sophie had been, throughout the story of the last several months, the person who said the true thing in the simple way, who cut through the adult habit of making things complicated by treating them as if they weren't. Charlotte had visited the hospital twice during Sophie's final weeks of intensive treatment, which Ethan had initially thought might be awkward. The billionaire CEO and the 7-year-old and the particular performance anxiety of an environment where someone is trying to make a good impression and a child has no patience for performance. But it hadn't been awkward. Charlotte had sat in the chair beside Sophie's bed and asked questions and listened to the answers, and Sophie had looked at her with the evaluating precision that she brought to things that mattered and had apparently arrived at some private conclusion about Charlotte Hayes that she kept to herself for approximately 6 weeks before acting on it. It was a Saturday in April. Sophie was home, had been home for 3 weeks, the treatment program complete, Dr. Reyes's voice finally shifting from encouraged to the considerably more satisfying phrase within normal parameters. She was in the kitchen making something that involved a level of culinary ambition that exceeded her technical abilities, and Ethan was at the table with papers from the Meridian office, and Charlotte was on the couch with her laptop, which had become a Saturday occurrence without being formally designated as one. "Charlotte," Sophie said from the kitchen, without looking up from whatever she was doing. "Yeah? Do you like my dad?" The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Ethan put down his pen. Charlotte, to her credit, didn't perform surprise. She looked at Sophie with a directness that matched Sophie's own. "Yes," she said. "I like your dad." "Like a friend or different?" Ethan said. "Sophie." "I'm asking Charlotte," Sophie said patiently. Charlotte looked at Ethan, and something in the look had a quality of acknowledgement, of two people who have been carefully not addressing something arriving at the moment where it gets addressed. She looked back at Sophie. "Different," she said. Sophie nodded once, with the satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis. "Okay," she said, and returned to her cooking. "Okay," Ethan said. "You both look at each other when you think the other one isn't watching," Sophie said. It was getting annoying. There was a silence in which neither Ethan nor Charlotte said anything, and then Charlotte laughed. Not the careful, almost smile that she usually allowed herself, but an actual laugh, brief and real, the kind that comes out before you've decided to let it. It changed her face completely. Ethan looked at her and thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that the version of Charlotte Hayes that existed in this kitchen on a Saturday morning was a different person from the one in the financial press photographs, and that he liked this version considerably. "She's not wrong," Charlotte said, looking at him. "She's usually not wrong," he said. They sat with that for a moment. In the kitchen that smelled like whatever Sophie was attempting and the coffee Ethan had made an hour ago, in the apartment that was small and unremarkable and full of drawings of horses that were now actually horses, and there was a quality to the moment that Ethan recognized, not as the beginning of something, because it had been beginning for months, but as the first moment when the beginning was acknowledged out loud. It didn't go from there to something cinematic. He didn't cross the room and say something that resolved the preceding months into a clean declaration. She didn't stand up from the couch with a speech. What happened was that Sophie announced that her cooking project was done, which turned out to be scrambled eggs that were slightly more cooked than was ideal, and all three of them ate them at the kitchen table. And during this meal, Charlotte said something dry about the eggs that made Sophie argue back with considerable vigor, and Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the table where he'd spent so many nights doing his thinking, with the legal pad and the cold coffee and the weight of everything he was carrying, and felt the weight redistributed, not removed. Redistributed. That was the honest version of it. Sophie was well, but the vigilance of a parent whose child has been seriously ill doesn't just turn off. It becomes part of how you move through the world, a permanent awareness of fragility and the unreliability of tomorrow. The regulatory cases were proceeding, but they moved slowly and had uncertain outcomes and required ongoing attention from Diana and occasional depositions from Ethan that were tedious and stressful in roughly equal measure. The business was new enough that most days had an element of not knowing whether it was going to work, which was the condition of all new things, and was nonetheless uncomfortable to live inside. None of that was resolved. It was all still there. But sitting at the table with Sophie arguing about eggs and Charlotte arguing back, he felt the specific relief of not carrying it alone. That was different from happiness, less simple, more durable, more real. Bob. Meridian Advisory Partners took on its fifth client in May, which Charlotte said was the point at which she could stop lying awake at 3 a.m. doing mental arithmetic about the runway. The fifth client was a mid-market manufacturing company whose previous advisory relationship had cost them a significant amount on a poorly structured acquisition, and their CFO had found Charlotte through a contact who'd read the financial press coverage of the Vantage Capital investigation and thought, there is a person who turned down a bad deal at personal cost, which is the specific kind of person I want advising me. That was how most of their early clients came to them. Not through the institutional channels Charlotte had spent years cultivating, but through the specific credibility of having done the thing they said they would do when it cost them something. The Vantage story was not universally told as Charlotte's vindication. There were still voices in the financial press that characterized it as an impulsive decision that had damaged institutional value. But among the clients who mattered, among the people who were looking for an advisor they could trust, precisely because trust in this industry was scarce, the story said what they needed it to say. Ethan had not fully anticipated this part. He'd understood, abstractly, that the events of October would follow him in some way. That he would be, in certain contexts, the janitor who stopped a billion-dollar deal, a story attached to a person regardless of whether the person wanted the attachment. What he hadn't anticipated was that the story would function as a kind of credential for the exact work they were trying to do. A man who had walked into a boardroom with a handwritten legal pad and nothing to gain and had been right. That was a person some clients wanted in their corner. He was still figuring out how to be comfortable with that. He suspected it would take a while. The summer brought the hearing. It was in June, and it was not a trial. Marcus Webb's trial was still months away, but a regulatory hearing at which Ethan was required to give a full formal account of what he'd seen and done and analyzed. He prepared for it with Diana over several weeks, and the preparation was thorough and occasionally tedious and necessary. He sat in a government building in a room with a long table and officials and lawyers and gave his account in the careful, documented, sourced way that distinguished it from the account of a man with a grievance. And when it was done, he walked out into the June afternoon feeling something he hadn't expected, which was mostly just tired. Charlotte was waiting outside. She'd come without being asked. "How was it?" she said. "It was fine. It was a lot of talking." "You're good at structured talking when it counts." "I know. It's the unstructured kind I have trouble with." She looked at him. "No, you don't." He thought about it. "No?" he agreed. "I don't. Not anymore." They walked to the parking garage, and on the way she told him about a potential client she'd spoken with that morning, a family business in the second generation of ownership, trying to figure out whether to sell or restructure, and he asked the questions that came naturally, the ones about the underlying financials, the ownership dynamics, the specific vulnerabilities in the way the business was structured. By the time they reached her car, they'd been talking for 20 minutes, and he'd forgotten to be tired. She stopped at the car and looked at him with the expression he'd come to know well, the one doing several things at once, arriving somewhere. "I've been thinking," she said. "About the client? About the office?" She paused. "We should move. We've been growing into the Merchant Street space for 4 months, and we're going to need more room by fall." He'd been thinking the same thing. Renata said the same thing last week. Renata is usually right. "I know." Charlotte unlocked the car and then didn't get in, standing with her hand on the door in the afternoon light. "I've also been thinking about other things," she said. "Things that are not the office." He leaned against the car beside her. "I know. I'm not good at the part that comes after the decision," she said. "The operational part I'm fine with. The decision part I'm fine with. The part where you've decided something and you're in it and you have to be in it without always knowing what the next step is." She looked at him. "That part I'm not great at." "I know," he said again. "I've noticed." She gave him a look. "You could pretend to be surprised." "I could," he said. "But you'd prefer I didn't." She looked at him for a moment, and the look had the honesty in it that was the thing he'd recognized earliest about her and had never stopped being struck by. The refusal to perform, the preference for accurate over presentable. "Yes," she said, "I would prefer you didn't." He'd been thinking about this conversation for longer than he would have acknowledged if asked. He'd been thinking about the shape of it, not the words, because the words were the easy part, but the shape. What it meant to move towards something with someone when both people had been badly burned by the things they'd trusted. When both of them had paid real costs and carried real scars and were, in the language they'd never quite used for themselves, still figuring out how to not let those costs determine everything. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes." "I'm in it," he said. "Already. I think I have been for a while." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to be in it the same way at the same speed. I wanted you to know where I am." She was quiet for a moment. The parking garage had its ambient sounds. A car somewhere on a higher level. The hum of the ventilation system, the city outside reduced to a low frequency. "I know where I am too," she said. "I've been there for a while. She stopped. "I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing the thing where I move fast because moving fast is what I'm good at, and I don't stop to check if the direction is right." "Is the direction right?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "The direction is right." He nodded once. She nodded once. It wasn't a declaration over music. It was two people in a parking garage in June, agreeing on something they'd both known for months, in the way that felt right for who they were. Not theatrical, not managed, just true. She got in the car. He walked to where he'd parked his own, which was 2 levels up and considerably less new. He drove to the hospital. Sophie had a follow-up appointment, the good kind, the kind that was now about maintenance and monitoring rather than treatment. And when he walked into the examination room, she looked up from the magazine she'd been reading and said, "You look different." "Different how?" "Less like you're carrying something heavy." Dr. Reyes came in before he could respond, and the appointment was routine and positive, and included the phrase fully within normal parameters which Ethan had been waiting to hear for the better part of 2 years, and which landed, when it came, not as an explosion, but as a slow warmth. The particular feeling of something you've been tensed against for so long that when it finally releases, you don't quite know who you are without the tension. He cried in the car afterward, alone, while Sophie was waiting with the nurse for a follow-up prescription. Not dramatically, just briefly, without performing it, in the private space of his own car in the Mercy General parking structure. Then he wiped his face and went back inside and got Sophie, and they went for the kind of lunch they'd been saying they'd have when she was better, at a diner she'd chosen based on the photograph in a brochure she'd found somewhere, a place called Eddie's that had large booths and a rotating pie display. She ordered a slice of chocolate pie at 11:30 in the morning and defended this decision with conviction. He ordered coffee and the soup, which was his default, and she looked at his soup with the expression of someone who had opinions about his nutritional choices but had chosen not to voice them at this time. "Is Charlotte coming to the office party?" Sophie asked. The office party was a modest thing Charlotte had organized for the end of their first operating quarter. The 5 clients, Renata, Diana Cho, a few contacts. "It's her office," Ethan said. "Of course she's coming." "Is she going to bring anything, like food?" "I don't know, probably. You should tell her to bring the thing she made at your place that one time, the one with the—" "She didn't make that. I made that." Sophie looked at him. "You said Charlotte made it." "I said Charlotte suggested it. I made it. Same thing." "It's really not the same. Tell her to bring it anyway." He looked at his daughter across the diner booth, at the girl who had been sick and was now well, who drew horses and gave opinions about eggs and cut through complexity with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to find complexity impressive. She was eating chocolate pie with the full commitment of someone who had earned it. He watched her for a moment. "You know," he said, "when all of this started, the whole thing, I wasn't sure it was going to work out." She looked up from the pie. "The important thing?" "All of it. The company, Sophie's treatment, any of it." She considered this. "But it did. It did. Not the way I planned. Nothing went the way I planned." He looked at his soup, then at her. "But it worked out." She went back to the pie. "I knew it would," she said, with the infuriating confidence of someone who had in fact known it would, or had decided to believe it would, which in Sophie's case was roughly the same thing. "Did you?" "You always figure it out," she said. "You just take a while." He looked at her. He thought about the legal pad, about the service elevator at midnight, about a light left on in a conference room, about a cover page lying open on a table, the chain of events from that single observation, the boardroom, the analysis, the hearing, the company, the Merchant Street office with its spoon-tapping radiator and its brick wall view, the parking garage conversation in June. He thought about what it meant to live according to your principles, the version of that phrase that wasn't a motivational poster, but was actual and costly and imperfect and human. It didn't mean never being afraid. He'd been afraid through most of it, afraid of losing Sophie's insurance, afraid of being wrong, afraid of the lawsuit, afraid of what came next and what came after that. It didn't mean being certain. He'd been uncertain through most of it too. It meant doing the thing you believed was right even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed, and accepting that the cost was part of it, not an argument against it. He thought about the 2,300 people who still had jobs. He didn't know any of their names. They didn't know his. They'd never know what hadn't happened to them, and that was fine. That was exactly fine. The point was never the credit. The point was the thing itself. He thought about Charlotte in the parking garage saying the direction is right. He thought about Renata on her 3-year-old laptop pulling environmental filings at 2 in the morning. About Diana Cho saying you got a bad deal and then making sure the next deal was different. About Gerald Potts, his former supervisor, who'd called him last month out of nowhere to say he'd seen the press coverage and was glad it had worked out, which was a small thing, but was a real thing. He thought about Sophie drawing horses that looked like horses now. There was a version of this story that was about a janitor who became a hero, about corruption exposed and villains brought to justice, and love triumphing and everything resolving into a lesson. He didn't quite believe in that version. The real version was messier and slower and still in progress. The regulatory cases were still moving, the business was still new, the relationship was still finding its shape, and Sophie's follow-up appointments were now quarterly rather than gone. The real version had people in it who were wrong about things and said things they regretted and made decisions that cost more than they'd accounted for. But here was what he believed, sitting in this diner booth on an ordinary day in June, watching his daughter eat pie. That the people you become through the difficult things are realer than the people you were before them. That being visible, truly visible, known for what you actually were rather than for what your position said you were, was worth more than the security of invisibility. That trust, the hard-won kind, the kind built through difficulty rather than circumstance, was a different and sturdier thing than comfort. He believed that you could lose the job and the career and the version of your life you'd planned, and still find, on the other side of it, something that was genuinely yours. He believed that the most important thing he'd done in the last several years was not the analysis or the hearing or the business or any of the things that had made the financial press. It was the smaller, continuous thing, showing up for Sophie every day, even when showing up was an exhausted man in hospital chairs who didn't have answers. It was the specific act of being present in the life of someone who needed him to be present. Everything else had come from that, showing up, being present, seeing what was actually there rather than what was convenient. He'd walked into conference room B with a mop at midnight because it was his job to clean it. He'd looked at the papers on the table because he'd looked at papers on tables his whole career, and a number had been wrong in a way he recognized, and the recognizing had cost him nothing and potentially everything, and he'd done it anyway. The things that change everything often start exactly that way. Not with a decision that feels momentous, but with a person seeing something clearly and deciding that seeing it is enough reason to act. Sophie finished the pie and looked at the piece he hadn't touched on his side of the plate, which he'd ordered for himself and then forgotten about. "Are you going to eat that?" "No," he said. She pulled it across the table with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for permission. "You should eat more," she said. "Charlotte says the same thing." "You and Charlotte talk about my eating habits?" "We talk about a lot of things." He looked at her. "When?" "When you're doing the boring financial stuff and we're waiting for you." She said this with the comfortable casualness of someone describing a routine. "She comes over sometimes when you're working late and we watch the Nature Channel." He had not known this. "She brings the snacks," Sophie added. "She's good at snacks." He sat for a moment with this information, with the image of Charlotte Hayes on his couch, with his daughter watching the Nature Channel, which was so far from the Charlotte Hayes of the financial press coverage that it almost required recalibration. But it didn't, actually. It required no recalibration at all, because it was completely consistent with every version of Charlotte he'd observed in the preceding months. The person who did the actual thing, rather than the gesture, who showed up in the specific practical ways that mattered, who didn't announce what she was doing because she wasn't doing it for the announcement. "She's good at a lot of things," Ethan said. Sophie gave him a look that was approximately 60% patience and 40% amusement. "I know, Dad." He paid the bill. They walked out into the June afternoon, which was warm and unremarkable, and full of the ordinary sounds of a city that didn't know and didn't need to know what had happened in its buildings and courtrooms and hospital rooms and parking garages and kitchen tables over the preceding 8 months. The city just continued, the way cities do. Sophie took his hand as they walked to the car, the way she'd done when she was very small and had mostly stopped doing once she decided she was old enough not to need to. He didn't say anything about it. He just walked. He thought about the office on Merchant Street, and the whiteboard with the next quarter's projections, and the client meeting on Thursday, and the conversation that was ongoing and imperfect and real. He thought about a Monday morning 8 months ago when he'd stepped off a service elevator with a mop at midnight and seen a light left on in a room he was supposed to clean. He thought, this is what following a thing looks like when you follow it all the way to the end. Not a boardroom victory. Not a clean resolution with music underneath it. Just a man and his daughter walking to a car on an ordinary afternoon with work to do tomorrow and the day after, with things that were still in progress, and things that had resolved and things that had changed into something he hadn't expected and was glad for. The horse in the drawing looked like a horse. Sophie was well. The direction was right. That was enough. That was, when you examined it carefully, considerably more than enough. He opened the car door. Sophie got in. He got in. They drove home through the June afternoon, and the city moved around them, and the story, which had never been only about a deal or a fraud or a boardroom or a legal pad, continued in the only way stories actually continue. In the ordinary days, in the people you choose, in the life you decide is worth protecting and then protect.